You are about to hear the true story of a priest who had it all: wealth, charm, and power, until he was burned alive for a crime he didn't commit. But unlike a horror movie, this experience is designed for sleep. Our deep red visuals and soothing narration allow your mind to rest while you absorb the history. Alexandre Dumas uncovers the darkest witch trial in French history. How did an entire convent of nuns become possessed by demons that only one man could control? Was it mass hysteria or a political trap set by the most powerful man in France? Please like this video, comment "night" to let us know you're listening, and subscribe for more dark history sleep stories. Now let's begin. Celebrated Crimes, Urbain Grandier. Chapter 1. On Sunday, November 26, 1631, the town of Loudun buzzed with anticipation. The narrow streets leading to the Church of St. Pierre in the marketplace were especially crowded. A personage, recently the subject of much discussion, was expected. Opinions about him were sharply divided, leading to intense provincial arguments between his supporters and his detractors. The varied expressions on the faces of those gathered on doorsteps, which had become impromptu debating clubs, clearly showed the diverse emotions surrounding the man's announced return. Around 9 o'clock, a sympathetic ripple went through the crowd. "There he is! There he is!" flashed from group to group. At this cry, some retreated into their homes, shutting doors and darkening windows as if for a day of public mourning. Others threw their windows wide, as if to welcome joy. In moments, the initial uproar gave way to a deep, silent curiosity. Then, through the silence, a figure advanced, holding a laurel branch as a symbol of triumph. It was a young man, 32 to 34 years old, with a graceful, well-built physique and an aristocratic air. His features were beautiful, though somewhat haughty. Despite having walked 3 leagues to reach the town, his ecclesiastical robes were elegant and spotless. With his eyes turned to heaven, singing praises to the Lord in a sweet voice, he proceeded through the streets to the church with a slow, solemn gait, acknowledging no one. The entire crowd, mostly women, fell into step behind him, singing along. The prettiest girls in Loudun led the singing. The subject of all this commotion finally reached the porch of St. Pierre. He ascended the steps, knelt, and prayed softly. Rising, he touched the church doors with his laurel branch, and they opened as if by magic. The choir was revealed, decorated and illuminated as if for a major feast, with all its scholars, choir boys, singers, beadles, and vergers in place. The man walked up the nave, through the choir, and knelt a second time at the altar's foot, placing the laurel branch upon it. He then donned a snow-white robe and a stole, beginning the celebration of Mass before the congregation that had followed him. At the end of the Mass, a Te Deum was sung. The man who had just given thanks to God for his own victory, with all the solemn ceremony, usually reserved for kings, was the priest Urbain Grandier. 2 days prior, he had been acquitted by a decision from Monsieur d'Escoubleau de Sourdis, Archbishop of Bordeaux. This reversed a magistrate's conviction that had condemned him to fast on bread and water every Friday for 3 months, and forbade him from priestly functions in the diocese of Poitiers for 5 years, and in Loudun forever. These were the circumstances under which the sentence had been passed and then overturned. Urbain Grandier was born in Rovire, a village near Sable. After studying sciences with his father Pierre and his uncle Claude Grandier, both learned astrologers and alchemists, he entered the Jesuit college at Bordeaux at age 12. He had already received a good basic education. His professors quickly recognized his considerable accomplishments and his natural gifts for languages and oratory. They cultivated him into a thorough classical scholar, encouraging him to practice preaching to develop his talent. Soon, they grew very fond of a pupil likely to bring them such credit. As soon as he was old enough for holy orders, they appointed him to the parish of St. Pierre in Loudun, which was under the college's patronage. After a few months there, he received a prebendal stall in the collegiate church of St. Croix, thanks to the same patrons. The bestowal of these 2 positions on such a young man, a non-native of the province, made him seem a usurper of local rights and privileges. This drew the envy of his fellow ecclesiastics. Many other factors fueled their jealousy. As mentioned, he was very handsome. His father's instruction had opened the world of science to him, giving him insight into mysteries that baffled the ignorant. Furthermore, his comprehensive studies at the Jesuit college had elevated him above many common prejudices, for which he openly expressed contempt. Finally, the eloquence of his sermons drew much of the regular congregation away from other religious communities, especially the mendicant orders, who had previously dominated preaching in Loudun. All this, as noted, was more than enough to incite both jealousy and hatred to an extraordinary degree. We know how easily small-town gossip can incite popular contempt for anything perceived as beyond or above the ordinary. In a wider sphere, Urbain would have shone with his many gifts. But confined within the walls of a small town, all that might have led to his success in Paris contributed to his downfall in Loudun. It was also unfortunate for Urbain that his character, far from mitigating the resentment his genius inspired, intensified it. While cordial and agreeable with friends, Urbain was sarcastic, cold, and haughty towards his enemies. Once resolved on a course, he pursued it unflinchingly. He jealously demanded all honor due his rank, defending it as a conquest. He insisted on enforcing all his legal rights and resented opposition and angry words with a harshness that created lifelong enemies. Urbain first demonstrated this inflexibility in 1620, when he won a lawsuit against a priest named Meunier. He carried out the sentence with such rigor that it ignited an inextinguishable hatred in Meunier, which would erupt on the slightest provocation. A second lawsuit, also won by Urbain, concerned a house disputed by the chapter of St. Croix. Here again, he displayed the same determination to exact his strict legal rights to the last detail. Unfortunately, Mignon, the attorney for the unsuccessful chapter, was a vengeful, vindictive, and ambitious man. Too ordinary to achieve high status, yet too distinguished for his current secondary position. Mignon, a canon of St. Croix and director of the Ursuline convent, would play a significant role in the events to come. As hypocritical as Urbain was straightforward, Mignon's ambition was to gain a reputation for exalted piety wherever his name was known. He affected the asceticism of a hermit and the self-denial of a saint. With extensive experience in ecclesiastical lawsuits, he viewed the chapter's loss, which he had all but guaranteed as a success, as a personal humiliation. When Urbain celebrated his triumph and demanded every letter of the law, as he had with Meunier, he transformed Mignon into an enemy far more relentless and dangerous than the former. Meanwhile, this lawsuit led to a dispute between Urbain and a man named Barot, Mignon's uncle and partner. Barot was below average intelligence. To crush him, Urbain merely needed to utter a few disdainful words from his superior position, words that were branded as deeply as a red-hot iron. Though lacking in talent, Barot was very rich and childless, constantly surrounded by relatives vying for a place in his will. The mocking words directed at Barot thus spattered not only him, but also all who had sided with him, significantly increasing the number of Urbain's enemies. Around this time, an even graver event occurred. Among the most frequent visitors to Urbain's confessional was a young, pretty girl named Julie, daughter of the king's attorney, Trinquant. Trinquant, like Barot, was Mignon's uncle. Julie fell into such a state of debility that she was confined to her room. A friend, Martha Pelletier, gave up her social life to nurse Julie, dedicating herself so completely that she shut herself in the same room. When Julie Trinquant recovered and returned to society, it was revealed that Martha Pelletier, during her weeks of seclusion, had given birth to a child which had been baptized and put out to nurse. By one of those strange public whims, everyone in Loudun insisted that the real mother was not Martha, who had claimed the child as her own. Instead, they believed Martha Pelletier had sold her good name to her friend Julie for money. Of course, it was then considered beyond doubt that Urbain was the father. Trinquant, hearing the rumors about his daughter, used his authority as king's attorney to have Martha Pelletier arrested and imprisoned. Questioned about the child, she insisted she was its mother and would be responsible for its upkeep. Bringing a child into the world under such circumstances was a sin, but not a crime. Trinquant was therefore forced to release Martha. The abuse of justice he committed only spread the scandal further and solidified public belief in the rumors. Up to this point, whether by divine intervention or his own cleverness, Urbain Grandier had emerged victorious from every struggle. However, each victory had added to his growing number of enemies. They were now so numerous that anyone else would have been alarmed and tried to either conciliate them or take precautions against their malice. But Urbain, wrapped in his pride and perhaps confident of his innocence, ignored the advice of his most faithful followers, and continued on his path unheeding. All of Urbain's opponents until now had been unconnected, each pursuing individual ends. Believing their lack of cooperation was the cause of his success, Urbain's enemies now decided to unite to crush him. A conference was held at Barot's house. Besides Barot himself, Meunier, Trinquant, and Mignon attended. Mignon also brought Menuau, a king's counsel and his closest friend, who joined the conspiracy for reasons beyond mere friendship. Menuau was in love with a woman who consistently refused his advances, and he was convinced that her otherwise inexplicable indifference and disdain stemmed from Urbain having already captured her heart. The meeting's objective was to agree on the best means of driving their common enemy out of Loudun and its vicinity. Urbain's life offered his enemies few weaknesses. His only apparent vulnerability was a preference for female company. Consequently, the town's wives and daughters, with their unerring instinct, recognizing the young, handsome, and eloquent new priest, often chose him as their spiritual director. This preference had already offended many husbands and fathers. The conspirators concluded that Grandier was vulnerable here, and their best chance lay in attacking him at his weakest point. Almost immediately, vague rumors solidified. There were allusions, though no name was given, to a young Loudun girl who remained Grandier's primary mistress despite his frequent infidelities. Whispers then began that this young girl, troubled by her love for Urbain, had her scruples eased by an act of sacrilege. As a priest, in the dead of night, he had performed a marriage service between himself and his mistress. The more absurd these reports grew, the more they were believed. Soon, everyone in Loudun considered them true, though no one could name the mysterious woman who had dared to marry a priest. In a small town like Loudun, this was truly extraordinary. Resolute and courageous as he was, Grandier could not hide from himself that his path now led over quicksand. He felt that slander was secretly encircling him, and that once fully entangled, it would reveal itself, leading to mortal combat. Yet, he believed that to retreat was to admit guilt. Besides, for him, it was likely too late to turn back. So he continued on his way, as unyielding, scornful, and haughty as ever. Among those most active in spreading rumors about Urbain was Duthabat, an important provincial figure. The townspeople considered him to hold advanced views, a Sir Oracle, to whom the common folk turned for enlightenment. Some of Duthabat's criticisms of Grandier reached him, especially certain calumnies uttered at the Marquis de Belay's estate. One day Grandier, in priestly garments, was about to enter the church of Saint Croix for a service when he encountered Duthabat at the entrance. With his usual haughty disdain, Grandier accused him of slander. Duthabat, accustomed to speaking and acting as he pleased without fear of accountability, due to his wealth and influence over the narrow-mindedness of a small provincial town, was so enraged by this public reprimand that he raised his cane and struck Urbain. The opportunity this affront presented for Grandier to be revenged on all his enemies was too precious to neglect. Convinced, with good reason, that he would never obtain justice from local authorities, despite the disrespect shown to the church in his person, he decided to appeal directly to King Louis XIII. The king deigned to receive him and, deeming that the insult to a priest robed in sacred vestments required expiation, sent the case to the High Court of Parliament with instructions for it to be tried and decided there. Urbain's enemies realized they had no time to lose and seized his absence to make counter-accusations. Two men, Charbonneau and Bugrau, agreed to become informers and appeared before the ecclesiastical magistrate at Poitiers. They accused Grandier of corrupting women and girls, blasphemy, profanity, neglecting his daily breviary, and turning God's sanctuary into a place of debauchery. This information was recorded, and Louis Chauvet, the civil lieutenant, and the archpriest of Saint Marcel and Ludenois were appointed to investigate. Thus, while Urbain was pursuing legal action against Duthabat in Paris, accusations were being laid against him in Loudun. This matter proceeded with the acrimony common in religious prosecutions. Trinquant appeared as a witness, drawing many others after him. Any omissions in the depositions were filled in according to the prosecution's needs. The resulting case appeared so serious that it was sent to the Bishop of Poitiers for trial. Now, the bishop was not only surrounded by friends of Grandier's accusers, but also held a personal grudge against him. Some time before, Urbain, due to an urgent situation, had bypassed the usual notice for a marriage. The bishop, aware of this, found sufficient evidence against Urbain in the submitted papers, superficial as they were, to issue a warrant for his arrest. It read, Henri Louis, Châtaigneur de la Rocapizai, by divine mercy Bishop of Poitiers, in view of the charges and informations conveyed to us by the Archpriest of Loudun against Urbain Grandier, priest in charge of the Church of Saint-Pierre in the marketplace at Loudun, in virtue of a commission appointed by us directed to the said Archpriest, or in his absence to the Prior of Chassaignes, in view also of the opinion given by our attorney upon the said charges, have ordered and do hereby order that Urbain Grandier, the accused, be quietly taken to the prison in our palace in Poitiers, if it so be that he be taken and apprehended, and if not, that he be summoned to appear at his domicile within 3 days, by the first apparator priest or tonsured clerk, and also by the first royal sergeant, upon this warrant, and we request the aid of the secular authorities, and to them, or to any one of them, we hereby give power and authority to carry out this decree notwithstanding any opposition or appeal, and the said Grandier having been heard, such a decision will be given by our attorney as the facts may seem to warrant. Given at Dissay the 22nd day of October 1629, and signed in the original as follows, Henri Louis, Bishop of Poitiers. Grandier, as noted, was in Paris conducting his case against Duthabot when these proceedings began against him. Duthabot received a copy of the bishop's decision before Grandier knew of the charges. During his defense, Duthabot painted a terrible picture of Grandier's immorality and produced the damning document as proof. The court, unsure what to make of this turn of events, decided that before considering Grandier's accusations, he must appear before his bishop to clear himself of the charges against him. Consequently, he left Paris at once, arrived in Loudun only long enough to learn what had happened, and then proceeded to Poitiers to prepare his defense. However, no sooner had he arrived than he was arrested by a sheriff's officer named Chattery and confined in the episcopal palace prison. It was mid-November. The prison was always cold and damp, yet Grandier's request for transfer to another place of confinement was ignored. Convinced that his enemies had more influence than he had supposed, he resolved to be patient. He remained a prisoner for 2 months. During this time, even his warmest friends believed him lost. Duthabot openly mocked the proceedings against him, believing they would go no further. Barrault had already selected one of his heirs, Ismael Bouillot, as Grandier's successor as priest and prebendary. It was arranged that the lawsuit costs would be defrayed from a fund raised by the prosecutors, with the rich paying for the poor. As all witnesses lived in Loudun, and the trial was in Poitiers, bringing so many people such a distance would incur considerable expense. But the lust for vengeance proved stronger than the lust for gold. Each person's subscription was estimated according to their fortune, and each paid without a murmur. After 2 months, the case concluded. Despite the evident efforts by the prosecution to twist the evidence, the principal charge, that he had led astray many wives and daughters in Loudun, could not be sustained. No woman came forward to complain of being ruined by Grandier. No single victim of his alleged immorality was named. The conduct of the case was extraordinary. It was clear that the accusations were based on hearsay, not fact. Yet, a decision and sentence against Grandier were pronounced on January 3, 1630. The sentence was 3 months of fasting on bread and water each Friday as penance, inhibition from clerical functions in the Diocese of Poitiers for 5 years, and in Loudun forever. Both parties appealed this decision. Grandier appealed to the Archbishop of Bordeaux. His adversaries, on the advice of the diocesan attorney, appealed to the Parliament of Paris, pleading a miscarriage of justice. This latter appeal was made to overwhelm Grandier and break his spirit, but Grandier's resolve allowed him to face this attack boldly. He engaged counsel to defend his case before Parliament, while he himself pursued his appeal to the Archbishop of Bordeaux. However, with many necessary witnesses scattered over a great distance, the archiepiscopal court sent the appeal to the presidial court of Poitiers. The public prosecutor of Poitiers began a fresh investigation, which, conducted impartially, was not encouraging for Grandier's accusers. Many conflicting statements made by witnesses were repeated. Other witnesses openly declared they had been bribed. Still others stated their depositions had been tampered with. Among these was a priest named Mechin, and also Ismael Bouillot, whom Barot had so eagerly selected as a candidate for Grandier's preferences. Bouillot's deposition has been lost, but we can read Metchen's, as the original has been preserved. I, Gervais Metchen, curate in charge of the Church of Saint Pierre in the marketplace at Loudun, certify by these presents, signed by my hand, to relieve my conscience as to a certain report which is being spread abroad, that I said in support of an accusation brought by Gilles Robert, archpriest, against Urbain Grandier, priest in charge of Saint Pierre, that I had found the said Grandier lying with women and girls in the Church of Saint Pierre, the doors being closed. Item, that on several different occasions, at unsuitable hours both day and night, I had seen women and girls disturb the said Grandier by going into his bedroom, and that some of the said women remained with him from 1 o'clock in the afternoon till 3 o'clock the next morning, their maids bringing them their suppers and going away again at once. Item, that I had seen the said Grandier in the church, the doors being open, but that as soon as some women entered he closed them. As I earnestly desire that such reports should cease, I declare by these presents that I have never seen the said Grandier with women or girls in the church, the doors being closed, that I have never found him there alone with women or girls, that when he spoke to either someone else was always present, and the doors were open, and as to their posture, I think I made it sufficiently clear when in the witness box that Grandier was seated and the women scattered over the church. Furthermore, I have never seen either women or girls enter Grandier's bedroom either by day or night, although it is true that I have heard people in the corridor coming and going late in the evening. Who they were I cannot say, but a brother of the said Grandier sleeps close by. Neither have I any knowledge that either women or girls had their suppers brought to the said room. I have also never said that he neglected the reading of his breviary, because that would be contrary to the truth, seeing that on several occasions he borrowed mine and read his hours in it. I also declare that I have never seen him close the doors of the church, and that whenever I have seen him speaking to women, I have never noticed any impropriety. I have not ever seen him touch them in any way. They have only spoken together, and if anything is found in my deposition contrary to the above, it is without my knowledge, and was never read to me, for I would not have signed it, and I say and affirm all this in homage to the truth. Done the last day of October 1630, signed G. Metchen. In the face of such proof of innocence, none of the accusations could be considered established. So according to the decision of the Presidial Court of Poitiers, dated May 25, 1634, the bishop's court decision was reversed, and Grandier was acquitted of the charges. However, he still had to appear before the Archbishop of Bordeaux for his acquittal to be ratified. Grandier took advantage of a visit the Archbishop paid to his abbey at Saint-Jean-les-Marmes, just 3 leagues from Loudun. His adversaries, discouraged by the Poitiers proceedings, offered little defense. The Archbishop, after an examination that clearly revealed the accused innocence, acquitted and absolved him. Grandier's rehabilitation before his bishop had 2 important results. It clearly established his innocence and highlighted his considerable achievements and eminent qualities. The Archbishop, witnessing the persecutions Grandier endured, took a kindly interest in him. He advised Grandier to transfer to another diocese, leaving a town whose prominent inhabitants seemed to harbor relentless hatred toward him. But abandoning his rights was contrary to Urbain's character. He declared to his superior that, strong in his grace's approval and the testimony of his own conscience, he would remain in the place God had called him. Monseigneur de Sourdis did not press Urbain further, but he understood Urbain's character well enough to perceive that if Urbain should one day fall, it would be like Satan through pride. He added a sentence to his decision, recommending that Grandier fulfill his duties with discretion and modesty, according to the Father's decrees and canonical constitutions. Urbain's triumphant entry into Loudun, with which our narrative began, shows the spirit in which he received this recommendation. Chapter 2. Urbain Grandier was not satisfied with the arrogant display that marked his return, which even his friends considered ill-advised. Instead of letting the hatred he had provoked subside, or at least fall dormant, he pursued his case against Duthabat with renewed zeal. He succeeded in obtaining a decree from the Parliament of La Tournelle, summoning Duthabat to appear, where he was obliged to listen bareheaded to a reprimand, offer apologies, and pay damages and costs. Having overcome one enemy, Urbain turned his attention to the others. He proved more indefatigable in his pursuit of justice than they had been in their pursuit of vengeance. The archbishop's decision entitled him to monetary compensation and interest, as well as the restitution of his living revenues. When some objections were raised, he publicly declared his intention to exact this reparation to the last farthing. He began collecting all necessary evidence for a new lawsuit he intended to initiate for libel and forgery. In vain, his friends assured him that his innocence had been fully and brilliantly vindicated. In vain, they tried to convince him of the danger of driving the vanquished to despair. Urbain replied that he was ready to endure all persecutions his enemies might inflict, but as long as he felt right was on his side, he was incapable of retreating. Grandier's adversaries soon became aware of the storm gathering above them. Sensing that the struggle would be one of life or death, Mignon, Barot, Meunier, Duthabot, and Menuet met Trinquant at his house in the village of Pindadain. Their purpose was to consult about the dangers threatening them. Mignon, however, had already begun to weave the threads of a new intrigue, which he explained in full to the others. They listened favorably, and his plan was adopted. We shall see it unfold gradually, for it forms the basis of our narrative. We have already mentioned that Mignon was the director of the Ursuline convent at Loudun. The Ursuline order was quite modern, as historical controversies surrounding the martyrdom of Saint Ursula and her 11,000 virgins had long hindered the establishment of an order in her honor. However, in 1560, Madame Angélie de Bresse founded such an order in Italy, adopting the Augustinian rules. This gained Pope Gregory XIII approval in 1572. In 1614, Madeleine Lhuillier, with Pope Paul V approval, introduced this order into France by founding a convent in Paris. From there, it rapidly spread throughout the kingdom, so that in 1626, only 6 years before the events just described, a sisterhood was founded in the small town of Loudun. Although this community initially consisted entirely of ladies of good family, daughters of nobles, officers, judges, and the better class of citizens, and included among its founders Jeanne de Belfield, daughter of the late Marquis of Cozes and relative of Monsieur de Laubardemont, Mademoiselle de Fazili, cousin of the Cardinal Duke, 2 ladies of the house of Barbenis de Nogaret, Madame de Lamotte, daughter of the Marquis Lamotte Barras of Anjou, and Madame d'Escoubleau de Sourdis from the same family as the Archbishop of Bordeaux. These nuns had almost all entered the convent due to a lack of fortune. At its establishment, the community found itself richer in lineage than in money, and thus was obliged to purchase a private house rather than build one. The owner of this house was a certain Musat Dufresne, whose brother was a priest. This brother naturally became the first director of these godly women. Less than a year after his appointment, he died, leaving the directorship vacant. The Ursulines had bought the house much below its normal value, for it was considered haunted by the entire town. The landlord had rightly reasoned that there was no better way to get rid of ghosts than to confront them with a religious sisterhood, whose members, spending their days in fasting and prayer, would be unlikely to have their nights disturbed by bad spirits. Indeed, during the year they had already spent in the house, no ghost had ever appeared, a fact that greatly enhanced the nuns' reputation for sanctity. When their director died, the boarders took advantage of the situation to amuse themselves at the expense of the older nuns, who were generally disliked by the younger members of the establishment due to their strict enforcement of the order's rules. Their plan was to revive the spirits everyone believed had been permanently banished. So noises began to be heard on the roof, resolving into cries and groans. Growing bolder, the spirits entered the attics and garrets, announcing their presence with clanking chains. Finally, they became so familiar that they invaded the dormitories, where they dragged the sheets off the sisters and abstracted their clothes. Great was the terror in the convent, and widespread the talk in town. The Mother Superior called her wisest nuns together and asked their opinion on the best course of action in their delicate circumstances. Without a dissenting voice, they concluded that the late director should be immediately replaced by an even holier man, if such could be found. Whether for his reputation for sanctity or other reasons, their choice fell upon Urbain Grandier. When the offer of the post was brought to him, he replied that he was already responsible for 2 important charges, and therefore lacked the time to watch over the snow-white flock they wished to entrust to him, as a good shepherd should. He recommended the Mother Superior seek someone more worthy, and less occupied than himself. This answer, as might be supposed, wounded the sisters' self-esteem. They next turned their eyes toward Mignon, priest and canon of the Collegiate Church of St. Croix. He, though deeply hurt that they had not considered him first, eagerly accepted the position. However, the recollection that Grandier had been preferred before him kept alive in him one of those bitter hatreds that time, instead of soothing, intensifies. From the preceding narrative, the reader can see where this hate led. As soon as the new director was appointed, the Mother Superior confided to him the type of foes he would be expected to vanquish. Instead of comforting her by assuring her that no ghosts existed, and thus it could not be ghosts running riot in the house, Mignon saw that by pretending to lay these phantoms, he could acquire the reputation for holiness he so desired. So, he replied that the Holy Scriptures recognized the existence of ghosts by relating how the witch of Endor had made the shade of Samuel appear to Saul. He went on to say that the Church's ritual-possessed means of driving away all evil spirits, no matter how persistent, provided that the one undertaking the task was pure in thought and deed. He hoped soon, with God's help, to rid the convent of its nocturnal visitors. As preparation for their expulsion, he ordered a 3-day fast, followed by a general confession. It requires no great cleverness to understand how easily Mignon arrived at the truth by questioning the young penitents as they came before him. The boarders who had played at being ghosts confessed their folly, saying they had been helped by a young novice of 16, named Marie Aubin. She acknowledged this was true. It was she who used to get up in the middle of the night and open the dormitory door, which her more timid roommates locked most carefully from within every night before going to bed, a fact that greatly increased their terror when, despite their precautions, the ghosts still got in. Under the pretext of not exposing them to the superior's anger, whose suspicions would surely be awakened if the apparitions disappeared immediately after the general confession, Mignon directed them to renew their nightly frolics from time to time, but at longer and longer intervals. He then sought an interview with the superior and assured her that he had found the minds of all those under her charge so chaste and pure that he felt sure his earnest prayers would soon clear the convent of the spirits pervading it. Everything happened as the director had foretold, and the reputation for sanctity of the holy man, who by watching and praying had delivered the worthy Ursulines from their ghostly assailants, increased enormously in the town of Loudun. Chapter 3. Hardly had calm been restored when Mignon, Duthabot, Menuot, Meunier, and Barot, having lost their case before the Archbishop of Bordeaux, and now threatened by Grandier with a prosecution for libel and forgery, met. They convened to consult on the best means of defending themselves against this unbending man, whom they felt would destroy them if they did not destroy him first. The result of this consultation was that very shortly afterwards, strange reports began to circulate. It was whispered that the ghosts, supposedly expelled by the pious director, had again invaded the convent in an invisible and intangible form. Furthermore, several nuns, by their words and actions, had given incontrovertible proof of being possessed. When these reports were brought to Mignon's attention, he, instead of denying their truth, cast his eyes to heaven. He said that God was certainly great and merciful, but it was also certain that Satan was very clever, especially when backed by that false human science called magic. However, as for the reports, though not entirely without foundation, he would not go so far as to say that any of the sisters were truly possessed by devils. That, he stated, was a question only time could decide. The effect of such claims on minds already inclined to believe the impossible was profound. Mignon allowed the rumors to circulate for several months without intervention. Then, when the time was right, he visited Pierre Bar, the priest of Saint Jacques at Chinon. Mignon explained that the situation at the Ursuline convent had become so dire he could no longer bear the sole responsibility for the nuns' salvation. He implored Bar to accompany him to Loudun. Bar was exactly the man Mignon needed, melancholic, prone to dreams and visions, and eager for a reputation of asceticism and holiness. To imbue his visit with appropriate solemnity, Bar set out for Loudun at the head of all his parishioners. The entire procession walked, aiming to stir interest and curiosity. However, this measure was entirely unnecessary, lest would have set the town abuzz. While the faithful filled the churches, praying for the success of the exorcisms, Mignon and Bar began their work at the convent. They remained closeted with the nuns for 6 hours. Afterward, Bar emerged and announced that his parishioners could return to Chinon without him. He had decided to stay in Loudun to assist the venerable director of the Ursuline convent in the holy work he had undertaken. Bar urged them to pray morning and evening with fervent devotion, so that, despite grave dangers, the good cause might triumph. This advice, devoid of explanation, intensified public curiosity. The belief grew that not just one or two nuns, but the entire sisterhood were possessed. Soon, the name of the supposed sorcerer began to be openly whispered, Urbain Grandier. It was said Satan had ensnared him through his pride, and Urbain had made a pact with the evil spirit, selling his soul to become the most learned man on earth. As Urbain's knowledge far exceeded that of Loudun's inhabitants, this tale gained widespread credence, though a few enlightened individuals scoffed at the absurdities and laughed at what they considered mere theatrics. For the next 10 to 12 days, Mignon and Bar spent most of their time at the convent, sometimes for 6 hours, sometimes all day. Finally, on Monday, October 11th, 1632, they wrote to the priest of Venier, to Guillaume Saracet de la Guerinier, bailiff of the Ludinois, and to Louis Chauvet, civil lieutenant. They requested their presence at the Ursuline convent to examine 2 nuns possessed by evil spirits and to verify the strange and almost incredible manifestations of this possession. Thus formally summoned, the 2 magistrates had no choice but to comply. They were, it must be confessed, not without curiosity, eager to get to the bottom of the mystery that had captivated the town. They proceeded to the convent, intending to thoroughly investigate the reality of the possession and the efficacy of the exorcisms. If they judged the nuns truly possessed and the exorcists sincere, they would authorize the continuation of the efforts. But if not satisfied, they would promptly put an end to the entire affair as a farce. At the door, Mignon, wearing an alb and stole, met them. He stated that for over 2 weeks, the nuns had been tormented by specters and blood-curdling visions. He claimed the Mother Superior and 2 other nuns had been clearly possessed for over a week. Due to the efforts of Bar and some Carmelite friars assisting him against their common enemies, the devils had been temporarily driven out. However, on the previous Sunday night, October 10th, the Mother Superior, Jeanne de Belfield, known as Jeanne de Angers, and a lay sister named Jeanne Dumignes, had again been re-entered by the same spirits. Through exorcisms, it had been discovered that a new pact, symbolized by a bunch of roses, had been concluded, whereas the first had been 3 black thorns. Mignon added that during the first possession, the demons had refused to give their names. But through the power of his exorcisms, this reluctance had been overcome. The spirit that had repossessed the Mother Superior had finally revealed its name, Ashtaroth, one of God's greatest enemies. The devil that had entered the lay sister was of a lower order, called Sabulin. Unfortunately, Mignon continued, the 2 afflicted nuns were then resting. He requested the bailiff and the civil lieutenant to postpone their inspection briefly. The 2 magistrates were about to leave when a nun appeared, announcing that the devils were again tormenting the 2 nuns. Consequently, they accompanied Mignon and the priest from Venier to an upper room. It contained 7 narrow beds, only 2 occupied, one by the Mother Superior and the other by the lay sister. The Superior, more thoroughly possessed, was surrounded by Carmelite monks, the convent sisters, Mathurin Rousseau, priest and canon of St. Croix, and Manori, a town surgeon. No sooner had the 2 magistrates joined the others than the Superior was seized with violent convulsions, writhing and uttering squeals, precisely imitating a suckling pig. The 2 magistrates watched in profound astonishment, which deepened when they saw the patient now bury herself in her bed, now spring out of it. The entire performance was accompanied by such diabolical gestures and grimaces that, if not entirely convinced the possession was genuine, they were at least filled with admiration for the simulation. Mignon next informed the bailiff and the civil lieutenant that although the Superior had never learned Latin, she would reply in that language to all questions if they wished. The magistrates answered that, as they were there to thoroughly examine the facts, they begged the exorcists to provide every possible proof that the possession was real. Upon this, Mignon approached the Mother Superior and, having ordered silence, placed 2 of his fingers in her mouth. After performing the prescribed exorcism ritual, he asked the following questions word for word. Why have you entered into the body of this young girl? Because of animosity. By what pact? By flowers. What flowers? Roses. By whom were you sent? At this question, the magistrates noticed that the superior hesitated to reply. Twice she opened her mouth in vain, but the third time I said in a weak voice, "Say his surname." "Urbanus." Here there was again the same hesitation, but as if impelled by the will of the exorcist, she answered, "Grandier." "What is his profession?" "A priest." "Of what church?" "Saint Pierre." "Which person brought the flowers?" "Someone sent by the devil." As the patient pronounced the last word, she recovered her senses and, after repeating a prayer, tried to swallow a morsel of bread offered to her. However, she was obliged to spit it out, saying it was so dry she could not get it down. Something more liquid was then brought, but even of that she could swallow very little, as she fell into convulsions every few minutes. Upon this, the two officials, seeing there was nothing more to be learned from the superior, withdrew to one of the window recesses and began to converse in a low tone. Whereupon Mignon, fearing they had not been sufficiently impressed, followed them. He drew their attention to the fact that much of what they had just seen recalled the case of Gaufredi, who had been executed a few years prior by a decree of the Parliament of Aix in Provence. This ill-judged remark by Mignon so clearly revealed his aim that the magistrates made no reply. The civil lieutenant remarked that he was surprised Mignon had not tried to find out the cause of the enmity the superior had spoken of, which was so important to discover. But Mignon excused himself, saying he had no right to ask questions merely to satisfy curiosity. The civil lieutenant was about to insist on the matter being investigated when the lay sister, in her turn, went into a fit, thus extricating Mignon from his embarrassment. The magistrates immediately approached the lay sister's bed and directed Mignon to put the same questions to her as to the superior. He did so, but all in vain. All she would reply was, "To the other, to the other." Mignon attributed this refusal to answer to the inferior order of the evil spirit within her, referring all inquiries to Ashtaroth, its superior. As this was the only explanation, however inadequate, the magistrates received, they departed. They drew up a report of all they had seen and heard, without comment, merely appending their signatures. In the town, however, few showed the same discretion. The devout believed, the hypocrites feigned belief, and the worldly minded, who were numerous, openly discussed the doctrine of possession, expressing their complete incredulity. They wondered, and not without reason, what had induced the devils to leave the nuns' bodies for 2 days, only to return and resume possession, confounding the exorcists. Further, they questioned why the Mother Superior's devil spoke Latin, while the lay sisters were ignorant of it. A mere difference in hell's hierarchy did not seem a sufficient explanation for such an educational disparity. Mignon's refusal to continue his interrogations as to the cause of the enmity led them to suspect he knew he had reached the limit of Ashtaroth's classical knowledge, and felt it futile to continue the dialogue in Ciceronian idiom. Moreover, it was well known that only days before, Urbain's worst enemies had met in a conclave in the village of Poudardane. How foolishly Mignon had shown his hand by mentioning Gaufredi, the priest executed at Aix. Lastly, why was there no desire for impartiality shown by calling in exorcists other than Carmelite monks, an order known to have a private quarrel with Grandier? It had to be admitted that this perspective was not without shrewdness. The following day, October 12th, the bailiff and the civil lieutenant, having heard that exorcisms had been attempted again without their prior knowledge, requested Canon Rousseau to accompany them. They set out with him and their clerk for the convent. Upon arrival, they asked for Mignon, and, when he appeared, informed him that the matter of exorcism was of such importance that no further steps were to be taken without the authorities present. In the future, they demanded timely notice of every attempt to expel the evil spirits. They added that this was all the more necessary as Mignon's position as director of the sisterhood, and his well-known hatred for Grandier, would cast unworthy suspicions upon him, suspicions he ought to be the first to wish to quickly dispel. Therefore, the work he had so piously begun would be completed by exorcists appointed by the court. Mignon replied that while he had no objection to the magistrates being present at all exorcisms, he could not promise that the spirits would reply to anyone except himself and Barre. Just then, Barre entered, paler and more gloomy than ever. Speaking with the air of a man whose word no one could help believing, he announced that before their arrival, most extraordinary things had taken place. The magistrates asked what things, and Bar replied he had learned from the Mother Superior that she was possessed not by one, but by 7 devils, with Ashtaroth as their chief. Grandier, he claimed, had entrusted his pact with the devil, symbolized by a bunch of roses, to a certain Jean Pivart, to give to a girl who had introduced it into the convent garden by throwing it over the wall. This occurred on the night between Saturday and Sunday, ora secunda nocturna, 2 hours after midnight. Those were the Mother Superior's exact words, Bar stated, but while she readily named Pivart, she absolutely refused to give the girl's name. Upon asking what Pivart was, she replied, Pauper Magus, a poor magician. He then pressed her about the word magus, and she replied, Magicianus et civis, magician and citizen. Just as she uttered these words, the magistrates had arrived, and he had asked no more questions. The 2 officials listened with the seriousness befitting men entrusted with high judicial functions, and announced to the 2 priests their intention to visit the possessed women and witness these miracles themselves. The clerics offered no opposition, but expressed fear that the devils were fatigued and would refuse to reply. Indeed, when the officials reached the sick room, the 2 patients appeared to have regained some calm. Mignon took advantage of this quiet moment to say Mass, which the 2 magistrates listened to devoutly and calmly. While the sacrifice was offered, the demons dared not stir. It was expected they would offer some opposition at the elevation of the host, but everything passed without disturbance, save for the lay sister's hands and feet twitching a great deal. This was the only fact the magistrates thought worthy of mention in their report for that morning. Bar assured them, however, that if they returned around 3 o'clock, the devils would likely have recovered sufficiently to give a second performance. As the 2 gentlemen were determined to see the affair through, they returned to the convent at the appointed hour, accompanied by Irene de Saint Martha, Sieur de Chernos. They found the room where the possessed lay full of curious spectators, for the exorcists had been true prophets. The devils were at work again. The superior, as always, was the more tormented of the 2, as expected, having 7 devils within her at once. She was terribly convulsed, writhing and foaming at the mouth as if mad. No one could long continue in such a condition without serious injury. Bar, therefore, asked the chief devil how soon he would depart. Crosmain, tomorrow morning, he replied. The exorcist then tried to hasten him, asking why he would not leave at once. Whereupon the superior murmured the word pactum, a pact, then sacerdos, a priest, and finally finus, or finit, for even those nearest could not distinctly catch the word as the devil, doubtless afraid of committing a barbarism, spoke through the nun's tightly clenched teeth. This being decidedly unsatisfying, the magistrates insisted the examination continue, but the devils had again exhausted themselves and refused to utter another word. The priest even tried touching the superior's head with the pyx while prayers and litanies were recited, but it was all in vain, except that some spectators thought the patient's contortions became more violent when the intercessions of certain saints were invoked, such as Saints Augustine, Jerome, Antony, and Mary Magdalene. Bar next directed the Mother Superior to dedicate her heart and soul to God, which she did without difficulty. But when he commanded her to dedicate her body also, the chief devil indicated by fresh convulsions that he would not allow himself to be deprived of a domicile without resistance. He made those who had heard him say he would leave the next morning feel he had only said so under compulsion, and their curiosity about the outcome intensified. At length, despite the demon's obstinate resistance, the superior succeeded in dedicating her body also to God. Thus victorious, her features resumed their usual expression. Smiling as if nothing had happened, she turned to Bar and said there was no vestige of Satan left in her. The civil lieutenant then asked her if she remembered the questions she had been asked and the answers she had given. She replied she remembered nothing, but afterward, having taken some refreshment, she told those around her that she perfectly recollected how the first possession, over which Mignon had triumphed, had occurred. One evening about 10 o'clock, while several nuns were still in her room, though she was already in bed, it seemed to her that someone took her hand and laid something in it, closing her fingers. At that instant, she felt a sharp pain, as if pricked by 3 pins. Hearing her scream, the nuns came to her bedside to ask what ailed her. She held out her hand, and they found 3 black thorns sticking in it, each having made a tiny wound. Just as she told this tale, the lay sister, as if to prevent all commentary, was seized with convulsions. Bar recommenced his prayers and exorcisms, but was soon interrupted by shrieks. One of the persons present had seen a black cat come down the chimney and disappear. Instantly, everyone concluded it must be the devil and began to seek it out. It was caught with great difficulty, for terrified by the sight of so many people and the noise, the poor animal had sought refuge under a canopy. But at last, it was secured and carried to the superior's bedside, where Bar began his exorcisms once more, covering the cat with signs of the cross and adjuring the devil to take his true shape. Suddenly the touriere, the woman who received tradespeople, came forward, declaring the supposed devil to be only her cat. She immediately took possession of it, lest some harm should befall it. The gathering was about to disperse, but Bar, fearing the cat incident might cast a ridiculous light on the evil spirits, resolved to reawaken a salutary terror. He announced he would burn the flowers through which the second spell had supposedly worked. Producing a bunch of faded white roses, he ordered a lighted brazier brought forth. He then threw the flowers onto the glowing charcoal. To general astonishment, they were consumed without any visible effect. The heavens still smiled, no thunder pealed, and no unpleasant odor diffused through the room. Feeling that the plainness of this act of destruction had had a negative impact, Bar predicted that the morrow would bring forth wondrous things. The chief devil, he claimed, would speak more distinctly than before and would leave the superior's body, giving such clear signs of his departure that no one would dare to doubt the genuineness of the possession any longer. Thereupon, the criminal lieutenant, Henri Hervé, who had been present during the exorcism, stated they must seize the moment of the devil's exit to ask about Pavart, who was unknown in Loudun, despite everyone living there knowing everyone else. Bar replied in Latin, "Et hoc dicet epuellum nominabit." He will not only tell you about him, but he will also name the young girl. The young girl the devil was to name, it may be recalled, was she who had introduced the flowers into the convent, and whose name the demon until now had absolutely refused to give. On the strength of these promises, everyone went home to await the morrow with impatience. Chapter 4. That evening, Grandier requested an audience with the bailiff. Initially, he had dismissed the exorcisms as poorly concocted and glaringly improbable, but as the case progressed, it assumed a graver aspect. The intense hatred displayed by his enemies brought to mind the fate of Father Gaufredi, whom Mignon had mentioned. To preempt his adversaries, Grandier decided to lodge a complaint against them. His complaint was founded on Mignon having performed the exorcism right in the presence of the civil lieutenant, the bailiff, and many others, causing the allegedly possessed nuns to publicly name Urbain as the author of their possession. Branding this a falsehood and an attack on his honor, Grandier implored the bailiff, who held special jurisdiction, to order the nuns sequestered, separated from the rest of the sisterhood and from each other, for individual examination. Should any evidence of possession appear, he hoped the bailiff would appoint clerics of known rank and upright character to perform necessary exorcisms. Such unbiased men would be more impartial than Mignon and his adherents. He also requested an exact report of all occurrences during the exorcisms, so he could present it, if necessary, to any higher judgment he might appeal to. The bailiff provided Grandier with a statement of his conclusions, informing him that Bar had performed the exorcisms that day under the authority of the Bishop of Poitiers himself. Being a man of common sense and unprejudiced, the bailiff advised Grandier to lodge his complaint with his bishop. Unfortunately, Grandier was under the authority of the Bishop of Poitiers, who was heavily prejudiced against him, having done everything to prevent the Archbishop of Bordeaux from ratifying the Presidial Court's decision in Grandier's favor. Urbain could not hide from the magistrate that he had nothing to hope for from this quarter. It was decided he should await tomorrow's events before taking further steps. The impatiently awaited day finally dawned. At 8 o'clock, the bailiff, the king's attorney, the civil lieutenant, the criminal lieutenant, and the provost's lieutenant, with their respective clerks, were already at the convent. They found the outer gate open, but the inner door shut. In a few moments, Mignon appeared, escorting them to a waiting room. There, he told them the nuns were preparing for communion and requested they withdraw to a house across the street, opposite the convent. He promised to send word when they could return. The magistrates, having first informed Mignon of Urbain's petition, retired as requested. An hour passed, and as Mignon did not summon them despite his promise, they all went together to the convent chapel, where they were told the exorcisms were already over. The nuns had left the choir. Mignon and Bar came to the grating and announced they had just completed the rite, and thanks to their conjurations, the two afflicted nuns were now entirely free from evil spirits. They stated they had been working at the exorcism since 7 in the morning, and great wonders, of which they had drawn up an account, had come to pass. However, they had considered it improper to allow anyone other than the exorcists and the possessed to be present during the ceremony. The bailiff pointed out that their proceedings were not only illegal, but also cast suspicion of fraud and collusion in the eyes of the impartial. Moreover, as the superior had publicly accused Grandier, she was bound to publicly renew and prove her accusation, not in secret. Furthermore, it was a great insolence for the exorcists to invite people of their standing and character to the convent, keep them waiting an hour, then tell them they were considered unworthy to attend the ceremony they had been requested to witness. He concluded by saying he would draw up a report, as he had on previous days, detailing the extraordinary discrepancy between their promises and their performance. Mignon replied that he and Bar had had only one goal, the expulsion of the demons, and in that they had succeeded. Their success, he claimed, would greatly benefit the Holy Catholic faith, for they had gained such power over the demons that they had commanded them to produce miraculous proofs within a week of the spells cast on the nuns by Urbain Grandier and their wonderful deliverance. Thus, in the future, no one would be able to doubt the reality of the possession. Thereupon, the magistrates drew up a report of all that had happened and what Bar and Mignon had said. This was signed by all the officials present, except the criminal lieutenant, who declared that, having perfect confidence in the exorcist's statements, he was anxious to do nothing to increase the doubting spirit so prevalent among the worldly. The same day, the bailiff secretly warned Urbain of the criminal lieutenant's refusal to sign the report. Almost simultaneously, Grandier learned that his adversary's cause was strengthened by the adhesion of René Memon, seigneur de Silly and prefect of the town. This gentleman was held in great esteem due to his wealth, numerous offices, and powerful friends, among whom was the Cardinal Duke himself, whom he had formerly aided when the cardinal was only a prior. The nature of the conspiracy had now become so alarming that Grandier felt it was time to oppose it with all his strength. Recalling his conversation with the bailiff the preceding day, during which he had been advised to lay his complaint before the Bishop of Poitiers, he set out, accompanied by a Loudun priest named Jean Baron, for the prelate's country house at Dissay. The bishop, anticipating his visit, had already given orders. Grandier was met by Dupuis, the intendant of the palace, who, in response to Grandier's request to see the bishop, told him his lordship was ill. Urbain then addressed the bishop's chaplain, begging him to inform the prelate that his purpose in coming was to present the official reports drawn up by the magistrates regarding the events at the Ursuline convent, and to lodge a complaint about the slanders and accusations of which he was a victim. Grandier spoke so urgently that the chaplain could not refuse to deliver his message. However, he returned in a few moments and told Grandier, in the presence of Dupuis, Baron, and a certain Sieur Lebras, that the bishop advised him to take his case to the royal judges and earnestly hoped he would obtain justice from them. Grandier perceived the bishop had been warned against him and felt increasingly ensnared in the conspiracy surrounding him. But he was not a man to flinch before danger. He therefore returned immediately to Loudun and went once more to the bailiff, to whom he related all that had happened at Dissay. He then, a second time, made a formal complaint regarding the slanders circulated about him and begged the magistrates to have recourse to the king's courts in the matter. He also stated his desire to be placed under the protection of the king and his justice, as the accusations against him targeted his honor and his life. The bailiff hastened to make out a certificate of Urbain's protest, which simultaneously forbade the repetition of the slanders or the infliction of any injury upon Urbain. Thanks to this document, a change of roles occurred. Mignon, the accuser, became the accused. Feeling he had powerful support behind him, Mignon had the audacity to appear before the bailiff the same day. He stated he did not acknowledge the bailiff's jurisdiction, as both he and Grandier, being priests, could only be judged by their bishop. Nevertheless, he protested against Grandier's complaint, which characterized him as a slanderer, and declared himself ready to surrender as a prisoner to show everyone he did not fear the result of any inquiry. Furthermore, he had sworn an oath on the sacred elements the day before, in the presence of his parishioners who had come to Mass, that in all he had done, he had been moved not by hatred of grandeur, but by love of truth and desire for the triumph of the Catholic faith. He insisted the bailiff provide him with a certificate of his declaration, and served notice of the same on Grandier that very day. Chapter 5. Since October 13th, the day the demons had supposedly been expelled, life at the convent seemed to have returned to its usual quiet. But Grandier was not lulled by the calm. He knew his adversaries too well to imagine he would hear no more of them. When the bailiff expressed pleasure at this interval of repose, Grandier predicted it would not last long, as the nuns were merely rehearsing new parts for a more effective drama. Indeed, on November 22nd, René Mannouri, the convent surgeon, was dispatched to his colleague, Gaspard Joubert, begging him to come, bringing some town physicians to visit the two sisters, who were again tormented by evil spirits. Mannouri, however, had gone to the wrong man. Joubert possessed a frank and loyal character and detested anything underhand. Determined to participate only in a public and judicial manner, he immediately applied to the bailiff to ascertain if he had been called by official orders. The bailiff denied it and summoned Mannouri to ask by whose authority he had sent for Joubert. Mannouri declared the Touriere had run in fright to his house, claiming the nuns were never worse possessed, and that Mignon, the director, begged him to come at once to the convent, bringing all the doctors he could find. The bailiff, realizing fresh plots were forming against Grandier, sent for him and warned him that Bar had arrived from Chinon the day before and resumed his exorcisms at the convent. He added that it was currently reported in town that the Mother Superior and Sister Claire were again tormented by devils. The news neither astonished nor discouraged Grandier, who replied with his usual smile of disdain that it was evident his enemies were hatching new plots against him. As he had instituted proceedings for the former ones, he would take the same course with these. At the same time, knowing the bailiff's impartiality, he begged him to accompany the doctors and officials to the convent, be present at the exorcisms, and should any sign of real possession manifest itself, to sequester the afflicted nuns at once, and have them examined by persons other than Mignon and Bar, whom he had such good cause to distrust. The bailiff wrote to the king's attorney, who, despite his bias against Grandier, was compelled to see that the conclusions reached were correct. Having certified this in writing, he immediately sent his clerk to the convent to inquire if the superior were still possessed. In case of an affirmative reply, the clerk had instructions to warn Mignon and Bar that they were not to undertake exorcisms unless in the presence of the bailiff and such officials and doctors as he might choose to bring, and that they would disobey at their peril. He was also to inform them that Grandier's demands to have the nuns sequestered and other exorcists called in were granted. Mignon and Bar listened while the clerk read his instructions. They then stated they refused to recognize the bailiff's jurisdiction in this case. They had been summoned by the Mother Superior and Sister Claire when their strange illness returned, an illness they were convinced was nothing other than possession by evil spirits. They had, they claimed, hitherto carried out their exorcisms under the authority of a commission given them by the Bishop of Poitiers. As the permission had not yet expired, they would continue to exorcise as often as necessary. They had, however, notified the worthy prelate of what was happening, so that he might either come himself or send other exorcists as he saw fit, ensuring a valid opinion as to the reality of the possession. For up to the present, the worldly and unbelieving had taken it upon themselves to declare offhandedly that the whole affair was a mixture of fraud and delusion, in contempt of God's glory and the Catholic religion. As for the rest of the message, they would in no way prevent the bailiff and other officials, with as many medical men as they chose to bring, from seeing the nuns, at least until they heard from the bishop, from whom they expected a letter the next day. But it was for the nuns themselves to say whether it was convenient for them to receive visitors. As for themselves, they desired to renew their protest, and declared they could not accept the bailiff as their judge, and did not think it could be legal for them to refuse to obey a command from their ecclesiastical superiors, whether related to exorcism or any other matter properly within ecclesiastical court's cognizance. The clerk brought this answer to the bailiff, who, thinking it better to await the bishop's arrival or fresh orders from him, postponed his visit to the convent until the next day. But the next day came without anything being heard of the prelate himself or a messenger from him. Early in the morning, the bailiff went to the convent, but was not admitted. He then waited patiently until noon, and seeing no news had arrived from Dissay, and the convent gates were still closed against him, he granted a second petition from Grandier. This petition requested that Bar and Mignon be prohibited from questioning the superior and other nuns in a manner tending to blacken the character of the petitioner or any other person. Notice of this prohibition was served the same day on Bar and on one nun chosen to represent the community. Bar paid no attention to this notice, asserting the bailiff had no right to prevent his obeying the commands of his bishop. He declared that henceforth he would perform all exorcisms solely under ecclesiastical sanction, without any reference to lay persons, whose unbelief and impatience impaired the solemnity with which such rites should be conducted. The best part of the day passed without any sign of either bishop or messenger. Grandier presented a new petition to the bailiff. The bailiff at once summoned all the officers of the bailiwick and the attorneys of the king to lay it before them. But the king's attorneys refused to consider the matter, declaring upon their honor that although they did not accuse Grandier of being the cause, they nevertheless believed the nuns were truly possessed, convinced by the testimony of devout ecclesiastics in whose presence the evil spirits had come out. This was only the ostensible reason for their refusal, the real one being that the advocate was a relation of Mignon's, and the attorney a son-in-law of Trinket's, whose office he had succeeded. Thus Grandier, against whom all the ecclesiastical judges were arrayed, began to feel as if he were condemned beforehand by the judges of the royal courts, for he knew how very short was the interval between the recognition of the possession as a fact and the recognition of himself as its author. Nevertheless, despite the formal declarations of the king's advocate and attorney, the bailiff ordered the superior and the lay sister removed to houses in town, each to be accompanied by a nun as companion. During their absence from the convent, they were to be looked after by exorcists, women of high character and position, as well as physicians and attendants, all of whom he himself would appoint, with all others forbidden access to the nuns without his permission. The clerk was again sent to the convent with a copy of this decision. But the superior, having listened to the reading of the document, answered that in her own name and that of the sisterhood, she refused to recognize the bailiff's jurisdiction. She had already received directions from the Bishop of Poitiers, dated November 18th, explaining the measures to be taken in the matter, and she would gladly send a copy of these directions to the bailiff to prevent his pleading ignorance of them. Furthermore, she demurred to the order for her removal, having vowed to live always secluded in a convent, and no one could dispense her from this vow but the bishop. This protest having been made in the presence of Madame de Charnacé, aunt of two of the nuns, and Surgeon Mannouri, who was related to another, they both united in drawing up a protest against violence, in case the bailiff should insist on having his orders carried out. They declared that, should he make the attempt, they would resist him as if he were a mere private individual. This document, duly signed and witnessed, was immediately sent to the bailiff by the hand of his own clerk. Whereupon the bailiff ordered that preparations should be made for the sequestration and announced that the next day, November 24th, he would repair to the convent and be present at the exorcisms. The next day accordingly, at the appointed hour, the bailiff summoned Daniel Roger, Vincent Defoe, Gaspard Joubert, and Matthew Fanson, all four physicians, to his presence. Acquainting them with his reasons for having called them, he asked them to accompany him to the convent to examine, with the most scrupulous impartiality, two nuns whom he would point out, to discover if their illness were feigned or arose from natural or supernatural causes. Having thus instructed them as to his wishes, they all set out for the convent. They were shown into the chapel and placed close to the altar, separated by a grating from the choir, where the nuns usually sat to sing. In a few moments, the superior was carried in on a small bed, which was laid down before the grating. Bar then said Mass, during which the superior went into violent convulsions. She threw her arms about, her fingers clenched, her cheeks enormously inflated, and her eyes turned up so that only the whites could be seen. Mass finished, Bar approached her to administer Holy Communion and to commence the exorcism. Holding the holy wafer in his hand, he said, "Adora Deum tuum, Creatorum tuum, adore God thy Creator." The superior hesitated, as if finding great difficulty in making this act of love, but at length she said, "Adoro te, I adore thee." "Quem adoras?" "Whom do you adore?" "Jesus Christus," answered the nun, quite unconscious that the verb adoro governs the accusative. This mistake, which no sixth-form boy would make, gave rise to bursts of laughter in the church. Daniel Dowen, the provost's assessor, was constrained to say aloud, "There's a devil for you, who does not know much about transitive verbs." Bar, perceiving the bad impression the superior's nominative had made, hastened to ask her, "Cas est quem adoras?" "Who is it whom thou dost adore?" His hope was that she would again reply Jesus Christus, but he was disappointed. "Jesu Christ," was her answer. Renewed shouts of laughter greeted this infraction of one of the most elementary rules of syntax, and several of those present exclaimed, "Oh, your reverence, what very poor Latin!" Bar pretended not to hear, and next asked what was the name of the demon who had taken possession of her. The poor superior, greatly confused by the unexpected effect of her last two answers, could not speak for a long time. But at length, with great trouble, she brought out the name Asmodee, without daring to Latinaize it. The exorcist then inquired how many devils the superior had in her body, and to this question she replied quite fluently, "Six." The bailiff upon this requested Bar to ask the chief devil how many evil spirits he had with him. But the need for this answer had been foreseen, and the nun unhesitatingly returned, "Quinque, 5." This answer raised Asmodee somewhat in the opinion of those present. But when the bailiff asked the superior to repeat in Greek what she had just said in Latin, she made no reply, and on the adjuration being renewed, she immediately recovered her senses. The examination of the superior being thus cut short, a little nun who appeared for the first time in public was brought forward. She began by twice pronouncing the name of Grandier with a loud laugh. Then, turning to the bystanders, called out, "For all your number, you can do nothing worthwhile." As it was easy to see that nothing of importance was to be expected from this new patient, she was soon suppressed, and her place taken by the lay Sister Claire, who had already made her debut in the Mother Superior's room. Hardly had she entered the choir than she uttered a groan, but as soon as they placed her on the little bed on which the other nuns had lain, she gave way to uncontrollable laughter and cried out between the paroxysms, "Grandier, Grandier, you must buy some at the market." Bar at once declared that these wild and whirling words were proof of possession, and approached to exorcise the demon. But Sister Claire resisted, and pretending to spit in the face of the exorcist, put out her tongue at him, making indecent gestures, using a word in harmony with her actions. This word, being in the vernacular, was understood by everyone and required no interpretation. The exorcist then conjured her to give the name of the demon who was in her, and she replied, "Grandier." But Bar, by repeating his question, made her understand she had made a mistake, whereupon she corrected herself and said, "Elemi." Nothing in the world could induce her to reveal the number of evil spirits by whom Elemi was accompanied, so that Bar, seeing it was useless to press her on this point, passed on to the next question. "Quo pacto ingressus est demon?" By what pact did the demon get in? "Duplex, double," returned Sister Claire. This horror of the ablative, when the ablative was absolutely necessary, once more aroused the hilarity of the audience and proved that Sister Claire's devil was just as poor a Latin scholar as the superior's. Bar, fearing some new linguistic eccentricity on the part of the evil spirit, adjourned the meeting to another day. The paucity of learning shown in the nun's answers being sufficient to convince any fair-minded person that the whole affair was a ridiculous comedy, the bailiff felt encouraged to persevere until he had unraveled the entire plot. Consequently, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he returned to the convent, accompanied by his clerk, several magistrates, and a considerable number of Loudun's best-known people. He asked to see the superior. Being admitted, he announced to Bar that he had come to insist on the superior being separated from Sister Claire, so each could be exorcised apart. Bar dared not refuse before such a great number of witnesses. Therefore, the superior was isolated, and the exorcisms began all over again. Instantly, the convulsions returned, just as in the morning, only now she twisted her feet into the form of hooks, which was a new accomplishment. Having adjured her several times, the exorcist succeeded in making her repeat some prayers, and then sounded her as to the name and number of the demons in possession. Whereupon she said 3 times that there was one called a chaos. The bailiff then directed Bar to ask if she were possessed ex pacto magi, ex ora voluntate Dei, by a pact with a sorcerer or by the pure will of God, to which the superior answered, non est voluntas Dei, not by the will of God. Upon this, Bar, dreading more questions from the bystanders, hastily resumed his own catechism by asking who was the sorcerer. Urbanus, answered the superior. Est any Urbanus Papa? Is it Pope Urban? Asked the exorcist. Grandier, replied the superior. Quer ingressus es in corpus huges puelli? Why did you enter the body of this maiden? Said Bar. Propter presentium tuum, because of your presence, answered the superior. At this point, the bailiff, seeing no reason why the dialogue between Bar and the superior should ever end, interjected and demanded that questions suggested by him and the other officials present should be put to the superior. He promised that if she answered 3 or 4 such questions correctly, he and those with him would believe in the reality of the possession and would certify to that effect. Bar accepted the challenge, but unluckily just at that moment the superior regained consciousness, and as it was already late, everyone retired. Chapter 6. The next day, November 25th, the bailiff and most officers from both jurisdictions returned to the convent. They were led to the choir, and after a few moments, the curtains behind the grating opened, revealing the superior on her bed. Bar began with Massachusetts. During the service, the superior was seized with convulsions, exclaiming 2 or 3 times, Grandier, Grandier, false priest. After Mass, the celebrant approached the grating, holding the pyx over his head. He declared his actions were motivated by the purest intentions and highest integrity, vowing no desire to harm anyone. He then asked God to strike him dead if he had engaged in any wrongdoing, collusion, or instigated deceit among the nuns during the investigation. The prior of the Carmelites followed, making the same declaration and oath, also holding the pyx over his head. He invoked the curse of Korah, Dathan, and Abram upon himself and his brethren if they had sinned during the inquiry. However, these protestations did not achieve their intended effect. Some onlookers openly criticized such oaths as sacrilege. Hearing the murmurs, Bar quickly began the exorcisms. He first approached the superior to offer her the Holy Sacrament. But as she saw him, she became terribly convulsed, attempting to snatch the pyx from his hands. Bar, by pronouncing sacred words, overcame her repulsion and managed to place the wafer in her mouth. She immediately pushed it out with her tongue, as if nauseated. Bar caught it, gave it to her again, and forbade the demon to make her vomit. This time, she partly swallowed the sacred morsel, though she complained it was stuck in her throat. To help her, Bar gave her water 3 times. Then, as always during his exorcisms, he began interrogating the demon. By what pact didst thou enter the body of this maiden? By water, replied the superior. Among those with the bailiff was a Scotsman named Strachan, head of the Reformed College of Loudun. Hearing the answer, he challenged the demon to translate aqua into Gaelic. He stated that if the demon demonstrated the linguistic abilities attributed to evil spirits, he and others would be convinced the possession was genuine. Bar, unfazed, replied he would make the demon speak Gaelic if God permitted, and ordered the spirit to do so. He repeated the command twice without success. On the 3rd repetition, the superior said, "Too much curiosity." When asked again, she responded, "God, I do not wish." At this, the demon stumbled in its Latin, confusing the first and third persons. Its response, "God, I do not wish," made no sense in context, as the intended answer was "God does not wish." The Scotsman laughed heartily at this nonsense, and proposed that Bar allow his devil to compete with the boys in his 7th form. Bar, instead of accepting the challenge on the demon's behalf, hesitated, suggesting the devil was justified in not satisfying idle curiosity. "But, sir, you must be aware," said the civil lieutenant, "and if not, the manual you hold will teach you, that the gift of tongues is an unfailing symptom of true possession, and the power to tell what is happening at a distance is another." "Sir," Bar countered, "the devil knows the language very well, but does not wish to speak it. He also knows all your sins. In proof of which, if you desire, I shall order him to list them." "I shall be delighted to hear it," said the civil lieutenant. "Be so good as to try the experiment." Bar was about to approach the superior when the bailiff held him back, remonstrating with him about the impropriety of his conduct. Bar then assured the magistrate he had never truly intended to carry out his threat. Despite Bar's attempts to redirect attention, the bystanders persisted in wanting to ascertain the devil's knowledge of foreign languages. At their suggestion, the bailiff proposed trying Hebrew instead of Gaelic, as Scripture described it as the most ancient language. Surely the demon would know it. This idea met with such applause that Bar was forced to command the possessed nun to say "aqua" in Hebrew. The poor woman, who struggled even with rote Latin phrases, made an impatient movement and exclaimed, "I can't help it, I retract." These words, heard and repeated by those nearby, created an unfavorable impression. One Carmelite monk attempted to explain them away, declaring the superior had not said "I retract," but "zakwe," a Hebrew word corresponding to "I threw water about." But "I retract" had been heard so distinctly that the monk's assertion was met with jeers, and the sub-prior publicly reprimanded him as a liar. Upon this, the superior suffered a fresh attack of convulsions. As all present knew these attacks usually signaled the performance's end, they withdrew, much amused by a devil who knew neither Hebrew nor Gaelic and whose Latin was so incorrect. However, the bailiff and civil lieutenant, determined to resolve any remaining doubts, returned to the convent at 3 o'clock that same afternoon. Bar met them and took them for a stroll in the convent grounds. During their walk, he expressed surprise that the civil lieutenant, who had previously informed Grandier by order of the Bishop of Poitiers, now seemed to side with him. The civil lieutenant replied that he would readily inform Grandier again if justified, but his current objective was to find the truth, a goal he felt confident he would achieve. This answer greatly displeased Bar. Drawing the bailiff aside, he remarked that a man of such distinguished ancestry, with many holding high church positions, and who himself held an important judicial post, ought to show less incredulity regarding the possibility of a devil entering a human body. Such proof, he argued, would redound to the glory of God and the good of the church and religion. The bailiff received this remonstrance with marked coldness, replying that he hoped always to be guided by justice, as his duty commanded. Bar pursued the subject no further, leading the way to the superior's apartment. As they entered the crowded room, the superior, seeing the pyx Bar carried, again fell into convulsions. Bar approached her, and as usual, asked the demon by what pact it had entered the maiden's body. Receiving the reply by water, he continued his examination. "What is the object of this pact?" "Unchastity." At these words, the bailiff interrupted the exorcist, ordering him to make the demon say the 3 words finis, pacti, and puritas in Greek. But the superior, who had previously escaped difficulties with an evasive answer, again resorted to too much curiosity. Bar agreed, stating they were indeed too curious. So the bailiff had to abandon his attempt to make the demon speak Greek, just as he had previously given up on Hebrew and Gaelic. Bar then continued his examination. "Who brought the pact?" "The sorcerer." "What is the sorcerer's name?" "Urbain." "What Urbain?" "Pope Urbain." "Grandier." "What is his profession?" "Curcatus." The audience was greatly affected by this new and unknown Latin word. However, Bar did not pause long enough for it to be fully appreciated, continuing at once. "Who brought the water from the pact?" "The magician." "At what hour?" "At 7 o'clock." "In the morning?" "In the evening." "How did he enter?" "By the door." "Who saw him?" "3 people." Here Bar paused to corroborate the devil's testimony. He assured his listeners that the Sunday after the superior's deliverance from the second possession, he, along with Mignon and one of the sisters, was dining with her around 7 in the evening. She showed them drops of water on her arm, their origin unknown. Bar instantly washed her arm with holy water and recited prayers. As he prayed, the superior's breviary was twice dragged from her hands and thrown at his feet. When he stooped to pick it up a second time, he received a box on the ear without seeing the hand that delivered it. Mignon then stepped forward and confirmed Bar's account in a long discourse, concluding by invoking terrible penalties upon himself if every word were not the exact truth. He then dismissed the assembly, promising to drive out the evil spirit the next day, and exhorting those present to prepare themselves, through penitence and Holy Communion, for the wonders that awaited them. Chapter 7. The last 2 exorcisms had been widely discussed in Loudun. Grandier, though absent, knew every detail, and once more filed a complaint with the bailiff. He asserted that the nuns maliciously continued to name him during the exorcisms as the cause of their supposed possession, clearly influenced by his enemies. He maintained he had no contact with them and had never even seen them. To prove this influence, he argued, the nuns absolutely needed to be sequestered. He highlighted the injustice of Mignon and Bar, his mortal enemies, having constant day and night access to them, which made collusion evident and undeniable. Grandier emphasized that the honor of God was at stake, as was his own, given his standing as the town's highest-ranking ecclesiastic. Considering all this, he requested the bailiff order the immediate separation of the possessed nuns from each other and their current associates. They should be placed under the control of clerics and impartial physicians in whom he could trust. He further prayed this be done despite any opposition or appeal, due to the matter's urgency. If the bailiff refused sequestration, Grandier declared he would protest the decision as a withholding of justice. The bailiff immediately endorsed the petition, agreeing to comply. After Grandier departed, the physicians who had attended the exorcisms presented their report to the bailiff. They confirmed observing convulsive movements in the Mother Superior's body, but stated that a single visit was insufficient for a thorough diagnosis. Such movements, they noted, could arise from natural or supernatural causes. They requested the opportunity for a comprehensive examination before rendering an opinion. To do this, they required permission to spend several days and nights continuously in the same room with the patients, treating them in the presence of other nuns and some magistrates. Furthermore, all food and medicine were to pass through the doctor's hands, and no one was to touch the patients except openly, or speak to them except audibly. Under these conditions, they pledged to discover the true cause of the convulsions and provide a full report. It was now 9 in the morning, the hour the exorcisms typically began. The bailiff promptly went to the convent, finding Bar midway through Mass and the superior in convulsions. The magistrate entered the church during the elevation of the host, noticing a young man named Desenier standing with his hat on among the kneeling Catholics. He ordered him either to uncover his head or leave. At this, the superior's convulsions intensified, and she cried out that Huguenots were in the church, giving the demon great power over her. Bar asked how many were present, and she replied, 2. This proved the devil was no stronger in arithmetic than in Latin, for besides Desenier, Councillor Abraham Gautier, one of his brothers, 4 of his sisters, René Fourneau, a deputy, and an attorney named Angevin, all of the Reformed faith were present. Seeing that those present were struck by this numerical inaccuracy, Bar tried to redirect their thoughts by asking the superior if she truly knew no Latin. When she replied she didn't know a single word, he held the pyx before her and ordered her to swear by the Holy Sacrament. She resisted at first, saying loudly enough for those around to hear, "My father, you make me take such solemn oaths that I fear God will punish me." To this, Bar replied, "My daughter, you must swear for the glory of God." And she took the oath. Just then, a bystander remarked that the Mother Superior was known to interpret the catechism for her scholars. She denied this, but admitted to translating the Paternoster and Creed for them. As the superior grew somewhat confused by this long series of embarrassing questions, she decided to feign convulsions again. However, she had only moderate success, for the bailiff insisted the exorcists ask her Grandier's exact whereabouts at that moment. Since ritual dictates that one proof of possession is the ability to state where people are without seeing them, and the question was posed in the prescribed manner, she was bound to answer. She said Grandier was in the great hall of the castle. "That is incorrect," said the bailiff, "for before coming here, I showed Grandier a house and asked him to stay there until my return. If anyone goes there, they will surely find him, for he wished to help me discover the truth without resorting to sequestration, a difficult measure to take with nuns." Bar was then ordered to send some of the monks, accompanied by a magistrate and a clerk, to the castle. Bar chose the Carmelite prior, and the bailiff designated Charles Chauvet, assessor of the bailiwick, Ismael Bouillot, a priest, and Pierre Thibault, an articled clerk. They all departed at once, while the others waited for their return. Meanwhile, the superior, who had not spoken a word since the bailiff's declaration, remained silent despite repeated exorcisms. So Bar sent for Sister Claire, believing one devil would encourage the other. The bailiff formally protested this step, insisting that a double exorcism would only cause confusion, allowing suggestions to be conveyed to the superior. He argued the proper course was to await the messenger's return before new conjurations. Though the bailiff's suggestion was reasonable, Barr felt he had to either remove the bailiff and other doubting officials or, with Sister Claire's help, delude them into belief. Therefore, the lay sister was brought in despite the opposition of the bailiff and other magistrates. Not wishing to appear to condone fraud, they all withdrew, declaring they could no longer witness such a disgusting comedy. In the courtyard, they met their messengers returning. The messengers reported going first to the castle, searching the great hall and other rooms, but finding no trace of Grandier. They then went to the house the bailiff mentioned, where they found him in the company of Father Verret, the nun's confessor, Mathurin Rousseau, Nicolas Benoit, canons, and Dr. Conti. From them, they learned Grandier had not been out of their sight for the past 2 hours. This being all the magistrates wanted to know, they went home. Their envoys, however, went upstairs and recounted their story, which had the expected effect. Thereupon, a Carmelite brother, wishing to weaken the impression and thinking the devil might have better luck on a second guess, asked the superior Grandier's current location. She answered without hesitation that he was walking with the bailiff in the church of St. Croix. A new deputation was immediately dispatched, but finding the church empty, they proceeded to the palace. There they saw the bailiff presiding at court. He had gone directly from the convent to the palace and had not yet seen Grandier. The same day, the nuns sent word they would no longer consent to exorcisms in the presence of the bailiff and his accompanying officials, resolving to answer no questions before such witnesses in the future. Learning of this insolence, which prevented the only impartial man he could rely on from attending future exorcisms, Grandier once more petitioned the bailiff, pleading for the sequestration of the 2 nuns, regardless of risk. The bailiff, however, in Grandier's own interest, dared not grant the request, fearing ecclesiastical authorities would nullify his procedure on grounds that the convent was outside his jurisdiction. He summoned a meeting of the town's principal inhabitants to consult on the best course for the public good. They concluded by writing to the Attorney General and the Bishop of Poitiers, enclosing copies of the reports and imploring them to use their authority to end these pernicious intrigues. The Attorney General replied that the matter, being entirely ecclesiastical, was outside Parliament's purview. The bishop sent no reply at all. However, he was not so silent toward Grandier's enemies. The poor outcome of the November 26th exorcisms necessitated increased precautions. They decided to ask the bishop for a new commission, appointing certain ecclesiastics to represent him during future exorcisms. Barr himself went to Poitiers to make this request. It was immediately granted, and the bishop appointed Basile, senior canon of Champigny, and Demerins, senior canon of Thouars, both related to some of Grandier's adversaries. The following is a copy of the new commission. Henri Louis Le Chataigneur de la Rocapizai, by Divine Will Bishop of Poitiers, to the senior canons of the Châtelet de Saint-Pierre de Thouars and de Champigny-Servies, greetings. We hereby command you to proceed to the town of Loudun, to the convent of the nuns of Saint Ursule, to be present at the exorcisms undertaken by Sieur Barr upon certain nuns of the said convent who are tormented by evil spirits, for which we have authorized Sieur Barr. You are also to prepare a report of all that occurs, and for this purpose, you may choose any clerk to accompany you. Given and executed at Poitiers, November 28, 1632. Signed, Henri Louis, Bishop of Poitiers. Countersigned, by order of the said Lord Bishop, Michelet. These 2 commissioners, having been notified, traveled to Loudun. Mayor Scott, one of the Queen's chaplains, arrived simultaneously. The pious Queen Anne of Austria had heard so many conflicting accounts of the Ursuline nun's possession that she desired, for her own edification, to uncover the truth. The case's growing importance was evident, as it was already being discussed at court. Despite receiving notice that the nuns would not admit them, the bailiff and civil lieutenant feared the royal envoy might be swayed, creating a report that would cast doubt on their findings. Thus, on December 1st, the day the exorcisms were to resume in the presence of the new commissioners, they went to the convent. They were accompanied by their assessor, the provost's lieutenant, and a clerk. They knocked repeatedly before being heard. Eventually, a nun opened the door, stating they could not enter, as they were suspected of bad faith, having publicly declared the possession a fraud. The bailiff, without arguing with the sister, asked to see Bar. Bar soon appeared in priestly vestments, surrounded by several people, including the Queen's chaplain. The bailiff complained that admittance had been refused to him and his companions, despite his authorization from the Bishop of Poitiers. Bar replied that, as far as he was concerned, he would not hinder their entry. "We are here with the intention of entering," said the bailiff, "and also to request that you put 1 or 2 questions to the demon, phrased according to the ritual. I am sure you will not refuse," he added, bowing to Mayor Scott, "to conduct this experiment in the Queen's chaplain's presence, as it would remove all suspicions of imposture that are unfortunately so rife concerning this matter." "In that respect, I shall do as I please, and not as you order me," was the exorcist's insolent reply. "It is, however, your duty to follow legal methods in your procedure," retorted the bailiff, "if you sincerely desire the truth. For it would be an affront to God to perform a spurious miracle in his honor, and a wrong to the Catholic faith, whose power lies in its truth, to attempt to give adventitious luster to its doctrines through fraud and deception." "Sir," said Bar, "I am a man of honor. I know my duty and I shall discharge it. But as for yourself, I must remind you that the last time you were here, you left the chapel in anger and excitement, an unbecoming attitude for one whose duty it is to administer justice." Realizing these recriminations were unproductive, the magistrates cut them short by reiterating their demand for admittance. When this was refused, they reminded the exorcists that they were expressly prohibited from asking questions that would cast a slur on anyone's character, under penalty of being treated as disturbers of public peace. At this warning, Bar, stating he did not acknowledge the bailiff's jurisdiction, shut the door in the faces of the 2 magistrates. With no time to lose if his enemy's machinations were to be thwarted, the bailiff and civil lieutenant advised Grandier to write to the Archbishop of Bordeaux, who had previously extricated him from danger, detailing his current predicament. This letter, accompanied by the bailiff's and civil lieutenant's reports, was immediately dispatched to His Grace of Escoubleau de Sourdis by a trusted messenger. As soon as he received the dispatches, the worthy prelate, realizing the gravity of the crisis and that the slightest delay could be fatal to Grandier, immediately set out for his abbey of Saint-Jean-les-Marmes, where he had previously vindicated the upright character of the persecuted priest through a fearless act of justice. It is easy to imagine the blow his arrival was to those who championed the possessing evil spirits. Hardly had he reached Saint-Jean, then he sent his own physician to the convent with orders to examine the afflicted nuns and assess their condition, to judge whether the convulsions were real or simulated. The physician arrived, armed with a letter from the Archbishop, ordering Mignon to permit a thorough investigation. Mignon received the physician with all due respect, but expressed great regret that he had not come sooner, as, thanks to his and Bar's efforts, the devils had been exorcised the previous day. Nevertheless, he introduced the Archbishop's envoy to the Superior and Sister Claire, whose demeanor was as calm as if they had never experienced any agitation. Mignon's statement thus confirmed, the doctor returned to Saint-Jean, his only testimony being the tranquility reigning in the convent at that moment. The imposture now so thoroughly exposed, the Archbishop was convinced that the infamous persecutions it had led to would cease at once and forever. But Grandier, better acquainted with his adversary's character, arrived at the abbey on December 27th and presented a petition to the Archbishop. In this document, he stated that his enemies, having previously made false and slanderous accusations from which he had been cleared through the Archbishop's justice, had spent the last 3 months fabricating and publishing that he had sent evil spirits into the bodies of nuns in the Ursuline convent of Loudun, despite never having spoken to any of the sisterhood there. He pointed out that the guardianship of the allegedly possessed sisters and the task of exorcism had been entrusted to Jean Mignon and Pierre Bar, who had unmistakably proven themselves his mortal enemies. Grandier further noted that the reports by Mignon and Bar, which widely diverged from those by the bailiff and civil lieutenant, boastfully claimed devils had been driven out 3 or 4 times, only to return and repossess their victims through successive pacts between the Prince of Darkness and Grandier. He argued that these reports aimed to destroy his reputation and incite public opinion against him. Although the demons had been put to flight by the Archbishop's arrival, it was probable they would return once he departed. If, in such a case, the archbishop's powerful support were unavailable, Grandier's innocence, however strongly established, would be obscured and denied by his inveterate foe's cunning tactics. Therefore, he prayed that, if these reasons proved cogent, the archbishop would prohibit Bar, Mignon, and their partisans, both secular and regular clergy, from participating in any future exorcisms or the control of any allegedly possessed persons. Furthermore, Grandier prayed that his grace would appoint, as a precautionary measure, other suitable clerics and lay persons to supervise the administration of food, medicine, and the rite of exorcism to those alleged to be possessed, and that all treatment be carried out in the presence of magistrates. The archbishop accepted the petition and wrote below it, "Having reviewed this petition and taken the opinion of our attorney, we have sent the petitioner, in advance of our said attorney, back to Poitiers, so that justice may be done to him. In the meantime, we have appointed Sieur Bar, Father Elisque, a Jesuit residing in Poitiers, and Father God of the Oratory, residing at Tours, to conduct the exorcisms, should they be necessary, and have given them an order to this effect. All others are forbidden to interfere with the said exorcisms, under pain of punishment according to law." From this, it is clear that His Grace the Archbishop of Bordeaux, in his enlightened and generous exercise of justice, had foreseen and provided for every possible contingency. As soon as his orders were made known to the exorcists, the possession ceased at once and completely, and was no longer even discussed. Bar withdrew to Chinon, the senior canons rejoined their chapters, and the nuns, temporarily rescued, resumed their life of retirement and tranquility. The archbishop, nevertheless, urged Grandier to prudently arrange an exchange of benefices. But Grandier replied that he would not, at that moment, trade his simple living in Loudun for a bishopric. Chapter 8. The exposure of the plot severely damaged the Ursuline community's standing. Far from bringing increased subscriptions and enhanced reputation, as Mignon had promised, the spurious possession resulted in open shame and private financial hardship. Parents quickly withdrew their daughters, depriving the nuns of their sole income. Their public disgrace filled them with despair, and it was revealed they had several altercations with their director. They reproached him for making them commit a great sin, overwhelming them with infamy and misery instead of securing the spiritual and temporal advantages he had promised. Mignon, though consumed by hate, was forced to remain quiet. Yet, he was as determined as ever to seek revenge. Being one of those men who never give up while a glimmer of hope remains, and whom no waiting can tire, he bided his time, avoiding notice, seemingly resigned to circumstances, but keeping his eyes fixed on Grandier, ready to seize the first chance to reclaim the prey that had escaped his grasp. And, unluckily, that chance soon presented itself. It was now 1633. Richelieu was at the height of his power, enacting his destructive agenda. He demolished castles where he could not execute individuals, in the spirit of John Knox's words, "Destroy the nests and the crows will disappear." One such nest was the crenellated castle of Loudun, and Richelieu had ordered its demolition. The person appointed to execute this order was a man of the type Louis XI had employed 50 years earlier to dismantle the feudal system, and Robespierre 150 years later to destroy the aristocracy. Every woodman needs an axe, every reaper a sickle, and Richelieu found his necessary instrument in de Laubardemont, a councillor of state. Laubardemont, however, was an intelligent instrument. He discerned the motivating passion of his wielder by how he was used, and skillfully adapted his nature to gratify that passion according to the wielder's character, sometimes with rough impetuosity, sometimes with deliberate, hidden advances. He was equally willing to strike with a sword or poison with calumny, depending on whether his mover lusted for blood or sought to dishonor his victim. Monsieur de Laubardemont arrived in Loudun in August 1633. To carry out his mission, he approached Sieur Memon de Silly, the town prefect, that old friend of the cardinals whom Mignon and Bar, as we have heard, had impressed so favorably. Memon saw Laubardmont's arrival as a divine sign that the seemingly lost cause of those in whom he took such an interest would ultimately triumph. He introduced Mignon and all his friends to Monsieur de Laubardemont, who received them cordially. They spoke of the Mother Superior, a relative of Monsieur de Laubardemont, and exaggerated the insult of the Archbishop's decree, calling it an affront to the entire family. Before long, The conspirators and the councillor were solely focused on how best to incur the Cardinal Duke's wrath upon Grandier. A way soon emerged. The Queen Mother, Marie de Medici, had an attendant named Hamon. Having once spoken with her, the Queen had taken a liking to her and given her a position close to her person. Consequently, Hamon came to be regarded as someone of importance in the Queen's household. Hamon was a native of Loudun, having spent most of her youth there among her own people, who belonged to the lower classes. Grandier had been her confessor, and she attended his church. As she was lively and clever, he enjoyed talking to her, and an intimacy eventually developed between them. It happened that, during a time when Grandier and other ministers were in temporary disgrace, a satire full of biting wit and mockery appeared, directed particularly against the cardinal. This satire was attributed to Hamon, who was known to share her mistress's hatred of Richelieu, as was natural. Protected by the Queen's favor, the cardinal had found it impossible to punish Hamon, but he still harbored deep resentment against her. It now occurred to the conspirators to accuse Grandier of being the true author of the satire. They asserted that he had learned all the details of the cardinal's private life from Hamon, knowledge that lent so much sharpness to the attack. If they could make Richelieu believe this, Grandier was lost. Once this plan was decided, Monsieur de Laubardemont was asked to visit the convent. The devils, knowing what an important personage he was, flocked there to give him a worthy welcome. Accordingly, the nuns suffered attacks of the most indescribably violent convulsions, and Monsieur de Laubardemont returned to Paris convinced of the reality of their possession. The first words the Councillor of State uttered to the Cardinal about Urbain Grandier revealed that he had wasted effort inventing the satire story. By merely mentioning Grandier's name, he could inflame the Cardinal's anger to any height he wished. The truth was, when Richelieu had been Prior of Cassay, he and Grandier had quarreled over a question of etiquette. Grandier, as priest of Loudun, had claimed precedence over the prior and had won his point. The cardinal had noted the affront in his blood-stained tablets, and at the slightest hint, de Laubardemont found him as eager for Grandier's ruin as the councillor himself. De Laubardemont was immediately granted the following commission. Sieur de Laubardemont, Councillor of State and Privy Councillor, will proceed to Loudun, and to any other necessary places, to institute proceedings against Grandier on all charges previously made against him, and on other facts since revealed, concerning the possession by evil spirits of the Ursuline nuns of Loudun, and of other persons likewise said to be tormented by devils through the evil practices of the said Grandier. He will diligently investigate everything from the beginning that pertains to the said possession or the exorcisms, and will forward to us his report, along with reports and other documents submitted by former commissioners and delegates. He will be present at all future exorcisms and take proper steps to obtain evidence of the said facts, that they may be clearly established. Above all, he will direct, institute, and carry through the said proceedings against Grandier and all others involved with him in the said case, until a definitive sentence is passed. Despite any appeal or countercharge, this case will not be delayed, due to the nature of the crimes, and no request for postponement made by the said Grandier will be honored. His Majesty commands all governors, provincial lieutenant-generals, bailiffs, seneschals, other municipal authorities, and all subjects whom it may concern, to provide every assistance in arresting and imprisoning all persons who must be constrained if required. Furnished with this order, which was tantamount to a condemnation, de Laubardemont arrived in Loudun on December 5, 1633, at 9 in the evening. To avoid being seen, he alighted in a suburb at the house of Master Paul Aubin, King's usher and son-in-law of Memon de Silly. His arrival was kept so secret that neither Grandier nor his friends knew of it, but Memon, Hervé Menuau, and Mignon were notified and immediately called on him. De Laubardemont received them, commission in hand. Broad as it was, it did not seem sufficient to them, for it contained no order for Grandier's arrest, and Grandier might escape. De Laubardemont, smiling at the idea that he could be so remiss, produced a duplicate order from his pocket, in case one copy was lost. It was dated like the commission, November 30th, signed Louis, and countersigned Philippos. It was conceived in the following terms: Louis, etc., etc. We have entrusted these presents to Sieur de Laubardemont, Privy Councillor, to empower the said Sieur de Laubardemont to arrest Grandier and his accomplices and imprison them in a secure place. All provosts, marshals, and other officers, and all our subjects in general, are ordered to lend whatever assistance is necessary to carry out the above order. They are commanded by these presents to obey all orders given by the said sieur. All governors and lieutenant generals are also hereby commanded to furnish the said sieur with whatever aid he may require at their hands. This document completed the other. It was immediately resolved to demonstrate their royal authority and, as a preventive measure, to arrest Grandier at once, without any preliminary investigation. They hoped this step would intimidate any official still inclined to side with Grandier, and any witness who might testify in his favor. Accordingly, they immediately sent for Guillaume Aubin, Sieur de Lagrange, and Provost's lieutenant. The Lombardment communicated the cardinal's commission and the king's order to him, requesting him to arrest Grandier early the next morning. Monsieur de Lagrange could not deny the two signatures and replied that he would obey. However, foreseeing from their methods that the upcoming proceedings would be an assassination rather than a fair trial, he sent a warning to Grandier about the orders he had received, despite being a distant connection of Memon, whose daughter was married to Lagrange's brother. But Grandier, with his usual intrepidity, while thanking Lagrange for his generous message, sent back word that, secure in his innocence and relying on God's justice, he was determined to stand his ground. So Grandier remained. His brother, who slept beside him, declared that his sleep that night was as quiet as usual. The next morning he rose, as was his habit, at 6 o'clock, took his breviary, and went out to attend matins at the church of St. Croix. He had barely stepped over the threshold before Lagrange, in the presence of Memon, Mignon, and the other conspirators who had come to gloat, arrested him in the king's name. He was immediately placed in the custody of Jean Piguet, an archer in His Majesty's guards, and the archers of the provosts of Loudun and Chinon, to be taken to the castle at Angers. Meanwhile, a search was instituted, and the royal seal affixed to the doors of his apartments, his presses, other furniture, in fact, every item and place in the house. Nothing was found that tended to compromise him, except an essay against the celibacy of priests, and 2 sheets of paper on which were written, in another hand than his, some love poems in the taste of that time. Chapter 9. For 4 months, Grandier languished in prison. According to reports from Michelon, commandant of Angers, and Pierre Backer, his confessor, Grandier was a model of patience and firmness. He spent his days reading or writing prayers and meditations, which were later used at his trial. Meanwhile, Jean Esteye, Grandier's 70-year-old mother, urgently appealed for his release. She seemed to regain youthful strength in her desire to save her son. Despite her efforts, Lombardment continued the examination, completing it on April 4th. Urbain was then returned from Angers to Loudun. An extraordinary cell awaited him in a house previously occupied by a sergeant named Bontemps, who had been a witness for the prosecution in Grandier's first trial. The cell was on the topmost story. Its windows had been walled up, leaving only one small, heavily barred slit. As an added precaution, the fireplace was grated to prevent devils from freeing the sorcerer. 2 unnoticeable holes in the corners of the room allowed Bontemps' wife to constantly watch Grandier, hoping to learn something useful for the upcoming exorcisms. In this dim room, lying on straw, Grandier wrote the following letter to his mother. My mother, I received your letter and everything you sent me except the woolen stockings. I endure any affliction with patience and feel more pity for you than for myself. I am very much inconvenienced because I want a bed. Try and have mine brought to me, for my mind will give way if my body has no rest. If you can, send me a breviary, a Bible, and a St. Thomas for my consolation. And above all, do not grieve for me. I trust that God will bring my innocence to light. Commend me to my brother and sister, and all our good friends. I am, mother, your dutiful son and servant Grandier. While Grandier was imprisoned in Angers, the cases of possession at the convent miraculously multiplied. It was no longer just the superior and Sister Claire who suffered from evil spirits, but also several other sisters. They were divided into 3 groups and separated. The superior, with Sisters Louise de Angers and de Saint Agnes, were sent to the house of Sieur Delaville, a lawyer for the sisterhood. Sisters Claire and Catherine de la Presentation were placed in Canon Morat's house. Sisters Elizabeth de la Croix, Monique de Saint Martha, Jean du Saint-Esprit, and Seraphique Archer were in a 3rd house. Memmon's sister, the wife of Mousant, oversaw the general supervision. This connected her closely with two of Grandier's greatest enemies. Bottom's wife reported everything she observed about Grandier to Memmon's sister, who then passed the information to the superior. Such was the nature of the sequestration. The selection of physicians was equally unusual. Instead of the most skilled practitioners from Angers, Tours, Poitiers, or Saumur, all, except Daniel Roger of Loudun, came from surrounding villages and lacked education. One had failed to obtain a degree or license and had been forced to leave Saumur. Another had worked in a small shop delivering goods before becoming a more lucrative quack. Fairness and propriety were also absent in the choice of apothecary and surgeon. The apothecary, Adam, was Mignon's first cousin and had been a prosecution witness in Grandier's first trial. On that occasion, Adam had defamed a young girl from Loudun and was sentenced by Parliament to make a public apology. Despite his well-known hatred for Grandier due to this humiliation, perhaps even because of it, he was entrusted with dispensing and administering prescriptions. No one supervised his work to ensure proper doses, or to check whether he substituted sedatives with stimulating drugs capable of causing real convulsions. The surgeon, Mannouri, was even more unsuitable. He was a nephew of Memnon de Silly and brother of the nun, who had most fiercely opposed Grandier's demand for sequestration of the possessed sisters during the second series of exorcisms. Grandier's mother and brother presented petitions detailing the doctor's incompetence and the apothecary's animosity. They could not, even at their own expense, obtain certified copies of these petitions, despite having witnesses ready to prove that Adam had once mistakenly dispensed Crocus metallorum for Crocus mantis, a mistake that caused a patient's death. In short, the conspirators were so determined to ensure Grandier's death that they did not even bother to conceal their infamous methods. The examination proceeded with vigor. One of the first formalities involved identifying the accused. Grandier published a memorial referencing the case of Saint Anastasius at the Council of Tyre, who was accused of immorality by a woman he had never seen. When this woman entered the hall to swear her deposition, a priest named Timothy approached her and spoke as if he were Anastasius. Falling into the trap, she responded as if she recognized him, thus proving the saint's innocence. Grandier, therefore, demanded that 2 or 3 men of his height and complexion, dressed exactly like him, confront the nuns alongside him. Since he had never seen any of them, and believed they had never seen him, he felt certain they would be unable to identify him, despite their allegations of intimacy. This demand, demonstrating such conscious innocence, was so embarrassing to address that no notice was taken of it. Meanwhile, the Bishop of Poitiers, elated at outmaneuvering the Archbishop of Bordeaux, who was powerless against a Cardinal-Duke's order, objected to Père Elisque and Père Got, the exorcists appointed by his superior. Instead, he named his own chaplain, who had been a judge and sentenced Grandier in his first trial, and Père Lactance, a Franciscan monk. These two, openly sympathizing with Grandier's accusers, stayed with Nicolas Mousant, one of Grandier's bitterest enemies. The next day, they went to the superior's apartments and began their exorcisms. When the superior first spoke, Père Lactance realized she knew almost no Latin. To avoid embarrassment during the exorcism, he ordered her to answer in French, though he continued to exorcise her in Latin. When someone boldly objected, stating that the devil, according to ritual, knew all languages and should reply in the language spoken, the father declared the incongruity was due to the pact, and some devils were more ignorant than peasants. Following these exorcists and 2 Carmelite monks, Pierre de Saint Thomas and Pierre de Saint Matherin, who had pushed their way in from the beginning, came 4 Capuchins sent by Père Joseph, head of the Franciscans, known as His Grey Eminence. Their names were Pères Luc, Tranquil, Pates, and Elicie. This allowed for much faster progress, as exorcisms could now be conducted simultaneously in 4 different places: the convent and the churches of Saint Croix, Saint Pierre du Martroi, and Notre Dame du Château. However, little of importance occurred on the first 2 occasions, April 15th and 16th. The doctors' declarations were vague, merely stating that what they had witnessed was supernatural, beyond their knowledge and the rules of medicine. The ceremony on April 23rd, however, presented some points of interest. The superior, in response to Père Lactance's questions, stated that the demon had entered her body in the forms of a cat, a dog, a stag, and a buck goat. Quote eyes. How often? Inquired the exorcist. I didn't notice the day, replied the superior, mistaking the word quote eyes for quando, when. Perhaps to exact revenge for this error, the superior declared the same day that Grandier had 5 devil's marks on his body. She claimed that while the rest of his body was insensible to pain, these spots were vulnerable. Surgeon Manori was ordered to verify this assertion, with the verification set for April 26th. In accordance with this mandate, Manori arrived early at Grandier's prison that day. He had Grandier stripped naked, cleanly shaven, then laid on a table with his eyes bandaged. But the devil was wrong again. Grandier had only 2 marks, not 5, one on his shoulder blade and the other on his thigh. Then followed one of the most abominable performances imaginable. Manori held a probe with a hollow handle, designed so the needle would slip inside when a spring was touched. When Manori applied the probe to parts of Grandier's body that the superior claimed were insensible, he pressed the spring. The needle appeared to bury itself in the flesh, but actually retracted into the handle, causing no pain. However, when he touched one of the supposedly vulnerable marks, he left the needle fixed, driving it several inches deep. The first time he did this, it drew such a piercing cry from Grandier, who was caught off guard, that it was heard in the street by the crowd gathered outside. From the mark on the shoulder blade, Manori moved to the one on the thigh. But even as he plunged the needle to its full depth, Grandier uttered neither cry nor groan, quietly repeating a prayer. Despite Manori stabbing him twice more through each mark, he could elicit nothing from his victim but prayers for his tormentors. The Loudun was present at this scene. The next day, the devil was addressed so forcefully that an acknowledgment was wrung from him. Grandier's body bore not 5, but only 2 marks. To the vast admiration of the spectators, the devil was also able to indicate their precise location this time. Unfortunately for the demon, a joke he made on this occasion detracted from the effect of his cleverness. When asked why he had refused to speak the previous Saturday, he claimed he hadn't been in Loudun that day, having spent the entire morning escorting the soul of a certain Le Proust, an attorney to the Parliament of Paris, to hell. This answer aroused such doubts among some laymen present that they took the trouble to examine the register of deaths. They found that no one named Le Proust of any profession had died on that date. This discovery rendered the devil less terrible and perhaps less amusing. Meanwhile, other exorcisms encountered similar interruptions. Père Pierre de Saint Thomas, conducting operations in the Carmelite Church, asked one of the possessed sisters where Grandier's magic books were. She replied they were kept at the house of a specific young girl, whose name she provided, the same girl to whom Adam had been forced to apologize. The Loudun, Moussant, Hervé, and Minot immediately hastened to the indicated house, searching rooms, presses, chests, wardrobes, and all secret places, but in vain. Upon returning to the church, they reproached the devil for deceiving them. He explained that a niece of the young woman had removed the books. They then rushed to the niece's dwelling, but she was not home, having spent the entire day at a certain church making her devotions. When they went there, priests and attendants affirmed she had not left all day. Thus, despite the exorcist's desire to oblige Adam, they were forced to drop the matter. These 2 false statements increased the number of unbelievers. However, it was announced that a most interesting performance would take place on May 4th. Indeed, the program was varied enough to arouse general curiosity. Asmodeus was to raise the superior 2 feet from the ground, and the fiends Isis and Cerberus, emulating their leader, would do the same for 2 other nuns. A 4th devil, named Beharit, would go even further, daring to attack the Loudun himself. Beharit would spirit his counselor's cap from his head and hold it suspended in the air for the duration of a misery. Furthermore, the exorcists announced that 6 of the strongest men in the town would attempt to prevent the contortions of the weakest convulsed nuns, and would fail. It hardly needs saying that the prospect of such entertainment filled the church to overflowing on the appointed day. Père Lactance began by calling on Asmodeus to fulfill his promise of raising the superior from the ground. Thereupon, she began to perform various evolutions on her mattress, and for a moment, it seemed as if she were truly suspended in the air. However, one of the spectators lifted her dress and revealed that she was only standing on tiptoe, which, while clever, was not miraculous. Shouts of laughter filled the air, intimidating Isis and Cerberus, so much that not even the exorcist's adjustments could elicit the slightest response. Beharit was their last hope. He replied that he was prepared to lift de Laubardment's cap, and would do so before the expiration of a quarter of an hour. It's important to note that these exorcisms now occurred in the evening, rather than the morning, as darkness could conceal illusions. Several skeptics present pointed out that the announced 15-minute delay would require artificial light for the next scene. They also noticed that de Laubardment had seated himself directly beneath an arch in the vaulted roof, where a hole had been drilled for the bell rope. Slipping out of the church, they climbed into the belfry and hid. Moments later, a man appeared working on something. They sprang on him, seizing his wrists. In one hand, he held a thin horsehair line with a hook attached. Frightened, he dropped the line and fled. Although de Laubardment, the exorcists, and the spectators waited, expecting the cap to rise into the air, it remained firmly on its owner's head. Père Lactance, unaware of the fiasco, continued to urge Beharit to keep his word, of course, to no effect. Overall, the May 4th performance was anything but smooth. No trick had succeeded. The demons had never been such bunglers. Yet, the exorcists were confident their final trick would go off without a hitch. A nun, held by 6 strong men, would miraculously escape their grasp despite their best efforts. 2 Carmelites and 2 Capuchins moved through the audience, selecting 6 burly porters and messengers from the town. This time, the devil met expectations, demonstrating strength if not cleverness. Although the 6 men tried to hold her to her mattress, the superior was seized with such terrible convulsions that she broke free from their hands, even throwing down one of her captors. This experiment, repeated thrice, succeeded each time, and belief seemed to return to the assembly. However, a physician from Saumur named Duncan, suspecting trickery, entered the choir. Ordering the 6 men to withdraw, he declared he would try to hold the superior down unaided. If she escaped, he vowed to make a public apology for his unbelief. De Laubardment tried to prevent this test, objecting to Duncan as an atheist. But Duncan was greatly respected for his skill and integrity, and the entire audience protested the interference so loudly that the commissioner was forced to yield. The 6 porters were dismissed, but instead of returning to their seats, they left the church through the sacristy. Duncan approached the bed where the superior had lain down again, seized her wrist, and ensuring a firm grip, told the exorcists to begin. Never before had it been so clear that the conflict was between public opinion and the private aims of a few. A hush fell over the church. Everyone stood motionless in silent anticipation. The moment Père Lactance uttered the sacred words, the superior's convulsions resumed. Yet, Duncan seemed to possess more strength than all 6 of his predecessors combined. Twist, writhe, and struggle as she might, the superior's wrist remained firmly clasped in Duncan's hand. At length, she fell back onto her bed, exhausted, exclaiming, "It's no use, it's no use. He's holding me." "Release her arm," shouted Père Lactance in a rage. "How can the convulsions take place if you hold her that way?" "If she is truly possessed by a demon," Duncan replied aloud, "he should be stronger than I. For it is stated in the ritual that among the symptoms of possession is strength beyond one's years, beyond one's condition, and beyond what is natural." "That is badly argued," said Lactance sharply. "A demon outside the body is indeed stronger than you, but when enclosed in a weak frame such as this, it cannot show such strength, for its efforts are proportioned to the strength of the body it possesses." "Enough," said de Laubardment. "We did not come here to argue with philosophers, but to build up the faith of Christians." With that, he rose from his chair amidst a terrible uproar, and the assembly dispersed in the utmost disorder, as if leaving a theater rather than a church. The poor outcome of this exhibition caused a cessation of interesting events for several days. As a result, many noblemen and other people of quality, who had come to Loudun expecting wonders and had been shown only commonplace, transparent tricks, began to feel it was not worth staying any longer and departed. This defection was much lamented by Père Tranquille in a small work he published on the affair. "Many," he wrote, "came to see miracles at Loudun, but finding the devils did not give them the signs they expected, they went away dissatisfied and swelled the numbers of the unbelieving." Therefore, to keep the town full, it was decided to predict a great event that would revive curiosity and increase faith. Père Lactance announced that on May 20th, 3 of the 7 devils inhabiting the Superior would exit, leaving 3 wounds in her left side, with corresponding holes in her chemise, bodice, and dress. The 3 departing devils were Asmodeus, Grezel de Trones, and Amon de Puissances. He added that the Superior's hands would be bound behind her back when the wounds appeared. On the appointed day, the church of St. Croix was filled to overflowing with sightseers, curious to know if the devils would keep their promises better this time. Physicians were invited to examine the Superior's side and her clothes. Among them was Duncan, whose presence guaranteed the public against deception. None of the exorcists dared to exclude him, despite their hatred, which they would have made him feel had he not been under the special protection of Marshal Breeze. After completing their examination, the physicians issued the following certificate. We have found no wound in the patient's side, no rent in her vestments, and our search revealed no sharp instrument hidden in the folds of her dress. With these preliminaries concluded, Père Lactance questioned her in French for nearly 2 hours, with her answers also in French. He then shifted from questions to adjurations. At this point, Duncan stepped forward and reminded them of the promise that the Superior's hands would be tied behind her back to prevent suspicion of fraud, stating that the moment had arrived to fulfill that promise. Père Lactance acknowledged the fairness of the demand. However, he argued that since many present had never witnessed the Superior in convulsions like those afflicting the possessed, it would be fair for her to be exorcised for their satisfaction before being bound. Accordingly, he began to repeat the exorcism. The Superior was immediately seized by frightful convulsions, which in a few minutes led to complete exhaustion. She fell face down to the ground, then turned onto her left arm and side, remaining motionless for some moments. After this, she uttered a low cry, followed by a groan. The physicians approached her. Duncan, seeing her remove her hand from her left side, seized her arm and found her fingertips stained with blood. They then examined her clothing and body, finding her dress, bodice, and chemise cut through in 3 places, the cuts being less than 1 inch long. There were also 3 scratches beneath the left breast, so slight as to be barely skin deep, the middle one being a barleycorn in length. Still, enough blood had oozed from all 3 to stain the chemise above them. This time, the fraud was so blatant that even de Laubardemont showed signs of confusion due to the number and standing of the spectators. However, he refused to allow the doctors to include their opinion on how the wounds were inflicted in their report. Grandier protested this in a statement of facts, which he drafted overnight and distributed the next day. It read as follows. Had the Superior not groaned, the physicians would not have removed her clothes and would have allowed her to be bound, unaware that the wounds were already made. The exorcists would then have commanded the devils to depart, leaving their promised traces. The Superior would then have undergone her most extraordinary contortions and a long fit of convulsions, at the end of which she would have been delivered from the 3 demons, and the wounds would have been found in her body. Her groans, by God's will, had betrayed her and thwarted the best-laid plans of men and devils. Why, do you suppose, he continued, were clean incised wounds, such as a sharp blade would make, chosen as a token, seeing that wounds left by devils resemble burns? Was it not because it was easier for the Superior to conceal a lancet to wound herself slightly, than to conceal an instrument heated enough to burn her? Why was the left side chosen rather than the forehead or nose, if not because she could not wound herself in either of those places without being seen by all spectators? Why was the left side rather than the right chosen, if not because it was easier for the Superior to wound herself with her right hand, which she habitually used, in the left side than in the right? Why did she turn on her left side and arm, and remain so long in that position, if not to hide from the bystanders the instrument with which she wounded herself? What do you think caused her to groan, despite all her resolution, if not the pain of the wound she inflicted upon herself? For even the most courageous cannot repress a shudder when the surgeon opens a vein. Why were her fingertips stained with blood, if not because the secreted blade was so small that the fingers holding it could not escape being reddened by the blood it caused to flow? How come it that the wounds were so superficial, barely deeper than the cuticle, while devils are known to rend and tear demoniacs when leaving them, if not because the superior did not hate herself enough to inflict deep and dangerous wounds. Despite Grandier's logical protest and the exorcist's brazen deceit, the Laubardement prepared a report of the expulsion of the three devils, Asmodeus, Grezel, and Ammon, from the body of Sister Jean de Angers, through 3 wounds below the heart. This report was shamelessly used against Grandier, and still exists as a monument not so much of credulity and superstition, but of hatred and revenge. To allay the suspicions the pretended miracle had aroused among eyewitnesses, Père Lactance, the following day, asked Balaam, one of the 4 remaining demons in the superior's body, why Asmodeus and his 2 companions had departed against their promise, with the superior's face and hands hidden from the people. To lengthen the incredulity of certain people, answered Balaam. As for Père Tranquille, he published a small volume describing the entire affair. With the irresponsible frivolity of a true Capuchin, he poked fun at those who could not swallow the miracles wholesale. They had every reason to feel vexed, he said, at the small courtesy or civility shown by the demons to persons of their merit and station. But if they had examined their consciences, perhaps they would have found the real reason for their discontent, and, turning their anger against themselves, would have done penance for having come to the exorcisms led by a depraved moral sense and a prying spirit. Nothing remarkable occurred from May 20th until June 13th, a day noteworthy for the superior vomiting a quill a finger long. This last miracle undoubtedly brought the Bishop of Poitiers to Loudun, not, as he told those who came to pay their respects, to examine the genuineness of the possession, but to force those to believe who still doubted, and to discover the classes which Urbain had founded to teach the black art to pupils of both sexes. Thereupon, the opinion began to prevail among the people that it would be prudent to believe in the possession. Since the king, the cardinal duke, and the bishop believed in it, continued doubt would expose them to charges of disloyalty to their king and their church, complicity in Grandier's crimes, and thus invite Laubardement's ruthless punishment. The reason we feel so certain that our work is pleasing to God is that it is also pleasing to the king, wrote Père Lactance. The bishop's arrival was followed by a new exorcism. An eyewitness, a good Catholic and a firm believer in possession, left us a written description more interesting than any we could provide. We will present it to our readers, word for word, as it stands. On Friday, June 23, 1634, on the eve of St. John, about 3 p.m., the Lord Bishop of Poitiers and de Laubardement being present in the church of St. Croix of Loudun, to continue the exorcisms of the Ursuline nuns by order of de Laubardement Commissioner, Urbain Grandier, priest in charge, accused and denounced as a magician by the said possessed nuns, was brought from his prison to the said church. There were produced by the said commissioner to the said Urbain Grandier 4 packs mentioned several times by the said possessed nuns at the preceding exorcisms, which the devils who possessed the nuns declared they had made with the said Grandier on several occasions. There was one in especial which Leviathan gave up on Saturday the 17th INST, composed of an infant's heart procured at a witch's sabbath, held in Orleans in 1631, the ashes of a consecrated wafer, blood, etc., of the said Grandier, whereby Leviathan asserted he had entered the body of the sister, Jean de Angers, the superior of the said nuns, and took possession of her with his coadjutors Beharit, Izes, and Balaam, on December 8, 1632. Another such pact was composed of the pips of Granada oranges, and was given up by Asmodeus and a number of other devils. It had been made to hinder Beharit from keeping his promise to lift the commissioner's hat 2 inches from his head, and to hold it there the length of a miseri, as a sign that he had come out of the nun. On all these pacts being shown to the said Grandier, he said, without astonishment, but with much firmness and resolution, that he had no knowledge of them whatever, that he had never made them, and had not the skill by which to make them, that he had held no communication with devils, and knew nothing of what they were talking about. A report of all this being made and shown to him, he signed it. This done, they brought all the possessed nuns, numbering 11 or 12, including 3 possessed lay sisters, into the choir of the church. They were accompanied by many monks, Carmelites, Capuchins, and Franciscans, as well as 3 physicians and a surgeon. Upon entering, the sisters made wanton remarks, calling Grandier their master, and exhibiting great delight at seeing him. Thereupon, Père Lactance and Gabriel, a Franciscan brother and one of the exorcists, fervently exhorted all present to lift their hearts to God and to make an act of contrition for their offenses against His divine majesty. They were asked to pray that their sins might not hinder the fulfillment of God's plans for His glory on that occasion. As an outward sign of heartfelt grief, they were to repeat the Confiteor in preparation for the blessing of the Lord Bishop of Poitiers. This having been done, Père Lactance continued, stating that the matter at hand was of such a moment and so important in its relation to the great truths of the Roman Catholic Church, that this consideration alone should excite their devotion. Furthermore, the affliction of these poor sisters was so peculiar and had lasted so long, that charity compelled all those with the right to work for their deliverance and the expulsion of devils, to employ the power entrusted to them by their office in accomplishing so worthy a task through the forms of exorcism prescribed by the Church to its ministers. Then, addressing Grandier, he said that as an anointed priest he belonged to this number, and ought to help with all his power and energy, if the bishop allowed him and remitted his suspension. The bishop granted permission. The Franciscan friar offered a stole to Grandier, who, turning to the prelate, asked if he might take it. Receiving an affirmative reply, he placed it around his neck. When offered a copy of the ritual, he again sought permission to accept it and received the bishop's blessing, prostrating himself at his feet to kiss them. Thereupon, the Veni Creator Spiritus having been sung, he rose and, addressing the bishop, asked, "My lord, whom am I to exorcise?" The said bishop replied, "These maidens." Grandier again asked, "What maidens?" "The possessed maidens," was the answer. "That is to say, my lord," he said, "that I am obliged to believe in the fact of possession. The Church believes in it, therefore I too believe, but I cannot believe that a sorcerer can cause a Christian to be possessed unless the Christian consent." Upon this, some present exclaimed that it was heretical to profess such a belief, that the contrary was indubitable, believed by the whole Church and approved by the Sorbonne. To which he replied that his mind on that point was not yet irrevocably made up, that what he had said was simply his own idea, and that in any case he submitted to the opinion of the whole body of which he was only a member, that nobody was declared a heretic for having doubts, but only for persisting in them, and that what he had advanced was only for the purpose of drawing an assurance from the bishop that in doing what he was about to do, he would not be abusing the authority of the Church. Sister Catherine, brought to him by the Franciscan as the most ignorant of all the nuns and least susceptible to knowing Latin, he began the exorcism as prescribed by the ritual. But as soon as he began to question her, he was interrupted. All the other nuns were attacked by devils, uttering strange and terrible noises. Among them, Sister Claire approached, reproaching him for his blindness and obstinacy. He was forced to leave the nun he had begun with and address Sister Claire, who, throughout the exorcism, continued to talk at random, ignoring Grandier's words. These were also interrupted by the Mother Superior, to whom he finally turned, leaving Sister Claire. But it is to be noted that before beginning to exorcise the Superior, he said, speaking in Latin as before, that knowing she understood Latin, he would question her in Greek. To which the devil replied through the mouth of the possessed, "Ah, how clever you are! You know it was one of the first conditions of our pact that I was not to answer in Greek." Upon this he cried, "O pulchra illugio, egregia evasio! O superb fraud, outrageous evasion!" He was then told he was permitted to exorcise in Greek, provided he first wrote down what he wished to say. The Superior thereupon, he said, would be answered in whatever language he pleased. But it was impossible, for as soon as he opened his mouth, all the nuns recommenced their shrieks and paroxysms, displaying unexampled despair and giving way to convulsions. Each patient's convulsions assumed a new form. They persisted in accusing Grandier of using magic and the black arts to torment them, offering to wring his neck if allowed, and trying to outrage his feelings in every possible way. But this being against the prohibitions of the Church, the priests and monks present worked with the utmost zeal to calm the frenzy that had seized the nuns. Grandier, meanwhile, remained calm and unmoved, gazing fixedly at the maniacs, protesting his innocence, and praying to God for protection. Then, addressing the bishop and M. de Laubardement, he implored them, by the ecclesiastical and royal authority of which they were ministers, to command these demons to wring his neck, or at least to put a mark on his forehead, if he were guilty of the crime they accused him of. This, he argued, would show forth the glory of God, vindicate the authority of the church, and bring himself to confusion, provided the nuns did not touch him with their hands. But to this, the bishop and the commissioner would not consent, because they did not want to be responsible for what might happen to him, nor would they expose the authority of the church to the wiles of the devils, who might have made some pact on that point with Grandier. Then the exorcists, numbering 8, commanded the devils to be silent and cease their tumult. They ordered a brazier to be brought, and into this they threw the packs one by one. Whereupon the convulsions returned with such awful violence and confused cries, rising into frenzied shrieks, and accompanied by such horrible contortions, that the scene might have been taken for an orgy of witches, were it not for the sanctity of the place and the character of those present, of whom Grandier, in outward seeming at least, was the least amazed of any, although he had the most reason. The devils continued their accusations, citing the places, the days, and the hours of their intercourse with him. The first spell he cast on them, his scandalous behavior, his insensibility, his abjurations of God and the faith. To all this, he calmly retorted that these accusations were calumnies, and all the more unjust considering his profession, that he renounced Satan and all his fiends, having neither knowledge nor comprehension of them, that in spite of all, he was a Christian, and what was more, an anointed priest, that though he knew himself to be a sinful man, yet his trust was in God and in his Christ, that he had never indulged in such abominations, and that it would be impossible to furnish any pertinent and convincing proof of his guilt. At this point, no words could express what the senses perceived. Eyes and ears received an impression of being surrounded by furies, such as had never been gathered together before. Unless accustomed to such ghastly scenes as those who sacrificed to demons, no one could keep his mind free from astonishment and horror in the midst of such a spectacle. Grandier alone remained unchanged through it all, seemingly insensible to the monstrous exhibitions, singing hymns to the Lord with the rest of the people, as confident as if he were guarded by legions of angels. One of the demons cried out that Beelzebub was standing between him and Père Tranquille the Capuchin, upon which Grandier said to the demon, "Obmutescas, hold thy peace." Upon this the demon began to curse, saying that was their watchword, but they could not hold their peace, because God was infinitely powerful, and the powers of hell could not prevail against him. Thereupon they all struggled to get at Grandier, threatening to tear him limb from limb, to point out his marks, to strangle him, although he was their master. Whereupon he seized a chance to say he was neither their master nor their servant, and that it was incredible that they should in the same breath acknowledge him as their master and express a desire to strangle him. On hearing this, the frenzy of the nuns reached its height, and they kicked their slippers into his face. "Just look," he said, "the shoes drop from the hoofs of their own accord." At length, had it not been for the help and interposition of people in the choir, the nuns in their frenzy would have taken the life of the chief personage in this spectacle. So there was no choice but to take him away from the church and the furies who threatened his life. He was therefore brought back to prison about 6 o'clock in the evening, and for the rest of the day, the exorcists were employed in calming the poor sisters, a task of no small difficulty. Not everyone regarded the possessed sisters with the indulgent eye of the narrative's author. Many saw in this terrible exhibition of hysteria and convulsions an infamous and sacrilegious orgy, where revenge ran rampant. There was such a difference of opinion that it was considered necessary to publish the following proclamation, by means of placards, on July 2nd. All persons of whatever rank or profession are hereby expressly forbidden to traduce, or in any way malign, the nuns and other persons at Loudun possessed by evil spirits, or their exorcists, or those who accompany them either to the places appointed for exorcism or elsewhere, in any form or manner whatever, on pain of a fine of 10,000 livres, or a larger sum in corporal punishment should the case so require. And in order that no one may plead ignorance hereof, this proclamation will be read and published today from the pulpits of all the churches, and copies affixed to the church doors and in other suitable public places. Done at Loudun, July 2nd, 1634. This order greatly influenced worldly folk. From that moment, whether their belief strengthened or not, they no longer dared to express any incredulity. But despite that, the judges were put to shame, for the nuns themselves began to repent. On the day following the impious scene described above, Just as Père Lactance began to exorcise Sister Claire in the castle chapel, she rose. Turning towards the congregation, tears streaming down her cheeks, she said in a voice audible to all present that she was going to speak the truth at last in the sight of heaven. Thereupon, she confessed that all she had said against Grandier during the last fortnight was calumnious and false, and that all her actions had been done at the instigation of the Franciscan Père Lactance, the Director Mignon, and the Carmelite brothers. Père Lactance, not at all taken aback, declared that her confession was a fresh wile of the devil to save her master Grandier. She then made an urgent appeal to the bishop and M. de Laubardemont, asking to be sequestered and placed in the charge of other priests than those who had destroyed her soul by making her bear false witness against an innocent man. But they only laughed at the pranks the devil was playing and ordered her to be at once taken back to the house in which she was then living. When she heard this order, she darted out of the choir, trying to escape through the church door, imploring those present to come to her assistance and save her from everlasting damnation. But the proclamation had borne such terrible fruit that no one dared respond. So she was recaptured and taken back to the house where she was sequestered, never to leave it again. Chapter 10. The next day, an even more extraordinary scene unfolded. While Monsieur de Laubardemont questioned one of the nuns, the superior, Jeanne d'Angers, entered the courtyard. She was barefoot, in her chemise, with a cord around her neck. She remained there for 2 hours amidst a fierce storm, undeterred by lightning, thunder, or rain, waiting for Laubardemont and the exorcists. When the door finally opened, and the royal commissioner appeared, Sister Jeanne d'Angers threw herself at his feet. She declared she could no longer endure the horrible role they had forced her to play. Before God and man, she proclaimed Urbain Grandier innocent. She confessed that the hatred she and her companions felt for him stemmed from the frustrated desires his comeliness evoked, desires intensified by the seclusion of convent life. Monsieur de Laubardemont threatened her with his full displeasure, but she wept bitterly, stating that her only fear now was her sin. She believed that though the Saviour's mercy was great, the crime she had committed could never be pardoned. Laubardemont exclaimed that it was the demon within her speaking, but she retorted that the only demon by whom she had ever been possessed was the spirit of vengeance. It was her own evil thoughts, not a pact with the devil, that had allowed him into her heart. With these words, she slowly withdrew, still weeping. She went into the garden, tied one end of the cord around her neck to a tree branch, and hanged herself. However, some sisters who had followed her cut her down before life was extinguished. The same day, an order for her strict seclusion was issued, just as it had been for Sister Claire. The fact that she was a relation of Monsieur de Laubardemont did not lessen her punishment, given the gravity of her fault. It became impossible to continue the exorcisms. Other nuns might be tempted to follow the example of the Superior and Sister Claire, which would undermine the entire process. Besides, Urbain Grandier was already considered fully convicted. Therefore, it was announced that the examination had concluded. The judges would now consider the evidence and deliver their judgment. This long succession of violent and irregular legal breaches, the repeated denials of his claim to justice, the refusal to allow his witnesses, or to hear his defense, all convinced Grandier that his ruin was predetermined. The case had gained such notoriety that it was deemed necessary either to punish him as a sorcerer and magician, or to expose a royal commissioner, a bishop, an entire community of nuns, several monks, many reputable judges, and laymen of standing to penalties for calumny. Though this realization brought resignation, Grandier's courage did not falter. Believing it his duty as a man and a Christian to defend his life and honor to the end, he prepared and published another memorandum, titled Reasons for Acquittal. Copies were distributed to his judges. It was a substantial and impartial summary of the entire case, as if written by an outsider, beginning with these words: I entreat you in all humility to consider deliberately and with attention what the psalmist says in Psalm 82, where he exhorts judges to fulfill their charge with absolute rectitude. They themselves are mere mortals who will one day have to appear before God, the sovereign judge of the universe, to give an account of their administration. The Lord's anointed speaks to you today, who are sitting in judgment, and says, God stands in the congregation of the mighty, he judges among the gods. How long will you judge unjustly, and accept the persons of the wicked? Defend the poor and fatherless, do justice to the afflicted and needy. Deliver the poor and needy, rid them out of the hand of the wicked. I have said, you are gods, and all of you are children of the Most High. But you shall die like men, and fall like one of the princes. However, this appeal, though convincing and dignified, had no influence on the commission. On August 18th, the following verdict and sentence were pronounced. We have declared, and do hereby declare, Urbain Grandier duly accused and convicted of the crimes of magic and witchcraft, and of causing the persons of certain Ursuline nuns of this town, and of other females, to become possessed of evil spirits, wherefrom other crimes and offenses have resulted. By way of reparation, we have sentenced, and do hereby sentence, the said Grandier to make public apology, bareheaded, with a cord around his neck, holding a lighted torch of 2 pounds weight in his hand, before the west door of the church of St. Pierre in the marketplace, and before that of St. Ursule, both of this town, and there on bended knee to ask pardon of God, and the king, and the law. This done, to be taken to the public square of St. Croix, and there to be attached to a stake, set in the midst of a pile of wood, both to be prepared for this purpose, and to be burnt alive, along with the pacts and spells remaining in the hands of the clerk, and the manuscript of the book written by the said Grandier against the celibate priesthood. His ashes are to be scattered to the 4 winds of heaven. And we have declared, and do hereby declare, all and every part of his property confiscated to the king, with 150 livres first taken therefrom to purchase a copper plate. On this plate, the substance of the present decree shall be engraved, to be exposed in a conspicuous place in the said church of St. Ursule, there to remain in perpetuity. Before this sentence is carried out, we order the said Grandier to be put to the question ordinary and extraordinary, so that his accomplices may become known. Pronounced at Loudun against the said Grandier this 18th day of August 1634. On the morning of this sentencing, Monsieur de Laubardemont ordered the surgeon François Fourneau to be arrested at his home and taken to Grandier's cell, though Fourneau was ready to go voluntarily. Passing through an adjoining room, he heard the accused voice saying, "What do you want with me, wretched executioner? Have you come to kill me? You know how cruelly you have already tortured my body. Well, I am ready to die." Entering the room, Fourneau saw these words had been addressed to the surgeon Mannouri. An officer, to whom Laubardemont had lent the title of Officer of the King's Guard for the occasion, ordered Fourneau to shave Grandier completely, leaving not a single hair on his body. This formality was employed in witchcraft cases, based on the belief that if a single hair remained, the devil could render the accused insensible to torture. From this, Urbain understood that the verdict was against him, and he was condemned to death. Fourneau saluted Grandier, and began to carry out his orders. A judge then stated it was not enough to shave the prisoner's body. His nails must also be torn out, lest the devil hide beneath them. Grandier looked at the speaker with an expression of unutterable pity, and held out his hands to Fourneau. But Fourneau gently put them aside, declaring he would do no such thing, even if ordered by the Cardinal Duke himself. At the same time, he begged Grandier's pardon for shaving him. At these words, Grandier, who had for so long received only barbarous treatment, turned to the surgeon with tears in his eyes, saying, "So you are the only one who has any pity for me?" "Ah, sir," replied Fourneau, "you don't see everybody." Grandier was then shaved. Only 2 marks were found on him, one on the shoulder blade, as mentioned before, and the other on the thigh. Both marks were very sensitive, as the wounds Mannouri had made had not yet healed. After Fourneau certified this, Grandier was given not his own clothes, but wretched garments likely belonging to another condemned man. Then, despite his sentence being pronounced at the Carmelite convent, he was taken by the Grand Provost's officer, with 2 archers, accompanied by the provosts of Loudun and Chinon, to the town hall. There, several ladies of quality, including Madame de Laubardemont, driven by curiosity, sat beside the judges, awaiting the sentence's reading. Monsieur de Laubardemont occupied the clerk's usual seat, and the clerk stood before him. All approaches were lined with soldiers. Before the accused was brought in, Father Lactance and another Franciscan exorcised him, intending to compel the devils to leave him. Entering the judgment hall, they then exorcised the earth, the air, and the other elements. Only after this was done was Grandier let in. Initially, he was kept at the far end of the hall, allowing time for the exorcisms to take full effect. Then he was brought forward to the bar and ordered to kneel. Grandier obeyed, but his hands were bound behind his back, preventing him from removing his hat or skullcap. Thereupon, the clerk seized one, and the provost's officer seized the other, flinging them at Laubardemant's feet. Seeing that the accused fixed his eyes on the commissioner as if waiting for his next move, the clerk said, "Turn your head, unhappy man, and adore the crucifix above the bench." Grandier obeyed without a murmur, with great humility, and remained immersed in silent prayer for about 10 minutes. He then resumed his former attitude. The clerk began to read the sentence in a trembling voice, while Grandier listened with unshaken firmness and wonderful tranquility, even though it was the most terrible sentence imaginable, condemning him to be burned alive that very day, after suffering ordinary and extraordinary torture. When the clerk finished, Grandier spoke with a voice unmoved from its usual calm. "Messeigneurs, I aver in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, and the Blessed Virgin, my only hope, that I have never been a magician, that I have never committed sacrilege, that I know no other magic than that of the Holy Scriptures, which I have always preached, and that I have never held any other belief than that of our Holy Mother, the Catholic Apostolic Church of Rome. I renounce the devil and all his works. I confess my Redeemer, and I pray to be saved through the blood of the cross, and I beseech you, messeigneurs, to mitigate the rigor of my sentence, and not to drive my soul to despair." The concluding words led Laubardemant to believe he could extract some admission from Grandier through fear of suffering. He ordered the court cleared, and left alone with Maître Homain, criminal lieutenant of Orleans, and the Franciscans, he addressed Grandier sternly. He stated there was only one way to obtain any mitigation of his sentence: to confess the names of his accomplices and sign the confession. Grandier replied that having committed no crime, he could have no accomplices. Laubardemant then ordered the prisoner to be taken to the torture chamber, which adjoined the judgment hall, an order instantly obeyed. Chapter 11. The torture employed at Loudun was a variation of the boot, one of the most agonizing methods. Each of the victim's legs below the knee was placed between two boards. These two pairs were then laid one above the other and firmly bound at the ends. Wedges were then driven between the two middle boards with a mallet, for such wedges constituted ordinary torture and 8 extraordinary. The latter was rarely inflicted, reserved mainly for those condemned to death, as almost no one survived it. The sufferer's legs were often crushed to a pulp. In Grandier's case, Monsieur de Laubardemant, on his own initiative and unprecedentedly, added 2 extra wedges to the extraordinary torture, making a total of 10. Furthermore, the royal commissioner and the 2 Franciscans took it upon themselves to inflict the torture personally. Laubardemant ordered Grandier bound as usual, and his legs placed between the boards. He then dismissed the executioner and his assistants, directing the keeper of the instruments to bring the wedges. Laubardemant complained they were too small. Unfortunately, no larger ones were in stock, and despite threats, the keeper insisted he didn't know where to find others. Monsieur de Laubardemant asked how long it would take to make some, and was told 2 hours. Finding this too long to wait, he was forced to proceed with the existing wedges. Thereupon the torture began. Father Lactance, having exorcised the instruments, drove in the first wedge. Grandier, reciting a prayer in a low voice, did not utter a sound. A second wedge was driven home. This time, despite his resolve, the victim could not avoid interrupting his devotions with 2 groans. At each groan, Father Lactance struck harder, crying, "Dicas! Dicas! Confess, confess!" He repeated this so often and so furiously, until the end, that he was ever after popularly known as Father Dicas. When the second wedge was in place, Laubardemant showed Grandier his manuscript against the celibacy of priests, and asked if he acknowledged it as his handwriting. Grandier answered in the affirmative. Asked his motive for writing it, he explained it was an attempt to restore peace of mind to a poor girl he had loved, as evidenced by the 2 lines at the end. "If thy sensitive mind imbibes this teaching, it will give ease to thy tender conscience." Upon this, Monsieur de Laubardemant demanded the girl's name. Grandier assured him it would never pass his lips, known only to himself and God. Laubardemant then ordered Father Lactance to insert the 3rd wedge. As the monk's powerful arm drove it in, each blow accompanied by dicas, Grandier exclaimed, "My God, they are killing me, and yet I am neither a sorcerer nor sacrilegious." At the fourth wedge, Grandier fainted, muttering, "Oh, Father Lactance, is this charity?" Although his victim was unconscious, Father Lactance continued to strike. Having lost consciousness through pain, pain soon revived him. Laubardement seized this opportunity to demand a confession of his crimes. But Grandier stated, "I have committed no crimes, sir, only errors. Being a man, I have often gone astray, but I have confessed and done penance, and believe that my prayers for pardon have been heard. If not, I trust that God will grant me pardon now, for the sake of my suffering." At the fifth wedge, Grandier fainted once more. They revived him by splashing cold water on his face. He moaned, turning to Monsieur de Laubardement, "In pity, sir, put me to death at once. I am only a man, and I cannot answer for myself that if you continue to torture me so, I shall not give way to despair." "Then sign this, and the torture shall cease," answered the royal commissioner, offering him a paper. "My father," said Urbain, turning towards the Franciscan, "can you assure me in your conscience that it is permissible for a man, in order to escape suffering, to confess a crime he has never committed?" "No," replied the monk, "for if he dies with a lie on his lips, he dies in mortal sin." "Go on, then," said Grandier, "for having suffered so much in my body, I desire to save my soul." As Father Lactance drove in the sixth wedge, Grandier fainted anew. When he had been revived, Laubardement called upon him to confess that a certain Elizabeth Blanchard had been his mistress, as well as the girl for whom he had written the treatise against celibacy. But Grandier replied that not only had no improper relations ever existed between them, but that the day he had been confronted with her at his trial was the first time he had ever seen her. At the seventh wedge, Grandier's legs burst open, and blood spurted into Father Lactance's face. He wiped it away with the sleeve of his gown. "O Lord my God, have mercy on me. I die," cried Grandier, and fainted for the fourth time. Father Lactance seized the opportunity to take a short rest and sat down. When Grandier had once more regained consciousness, he slowly began to utter a prayer, so beautiful and moving that the provost's lieutenant wrote it down. But Laubardement, noticing this, forbade him ever to show it to anyone. At the eighth wedge, the bones gave way, and marrow oozed from the wounds. It became useless to drive in any more wedges, as the legs were now as flat as the boards that compressed them. Moreover, Father Lactance was quite exhausted. Grandier was unbound and laid upon the flagged floor. While his eyes shone with fever and agony, he prayed a second prayer, a true martyr's prayer, overflowing with faith and enthusiasm. But as he finished, his strength failed, and he again lost consciousness. The provost's lieutenant forced a little wine between his lips, which revived him. Then he made an act of contrition, renounced Satan and all his works once again, and commended his soul to God. For men entered, freed his legs from the boards, and found the crushed parts to be a mere inert mass, attached to the knees only by sinews. He was then carried to the council chamber and laid on a little straw before the fire. In a corner of the fireplace, an Augustinian monk was seated. Urbain asked leave to confess to him, which Laubardement refused, holding out the paper he desired to have signed once more. Grandier responded, "If I would not sign to spare myself before, am I likely to give way now that only death remains?" "True," replied Laubardement, "but the mode of your death is in our hands. It rests with us to make it slow or quick, painless or agonizing. So take this paper and sign." Grandier gently pushed the paper away, shaking his head in refusal. Thereupon, Laubardement left the room in a fury and ordered Fathers Tranquil and Claude to be admitted, they being the confessors he had chosen for Urbain. When they approached to fulfill their office, Urbain recognized them as two of his torturers. He stated that, as it was only 4 days since he had confessed to Father Grillo, and he did not believe he had committed any mortal sin since then, he would not trouble them. They cried out at him as a heretic and infidel, but without any effect. At 4 o'clock, the executioner's assistants came to fetch him. He was placed lying on a bier and carried out in that position. On the way, he met and recognized Mausant, who was accompanied by his wife. Turning to him, Grandier said, "I die your debtor, and if I have ever said a word that could offend you, I ask you to forgive me." When the place of execution was reached, the provost's lieutenant approached Grandier and asked his forgiveness. "You have not offended me," was the reply. "You have only done what your duty obliged you to do." The executioner then came forward, removed the backboard of the cart, and ordered his assistants to carry Grandier to where the pyre was prepared. As he was unable to stand, he was attached to the stake by an iron hoop around his body. At that moment, a flock of pigeons seemed to fall from the sky. Fearless of the crowd, which was so dense that the archers could not clear a way for the magistrates even with blows from their weapons, they began to fly around Grandier. One pigeon, as white as driven snow, alighted on the summit of the stake, just above his head. Those who believed in possession exclaimed that they were only a band of devils coming to seek their master. But many muttered that devils were not accustomed to assuming such a form, and persisted in believing that the doves had come, in the absence of men, to bear witness to Grandier's innocence. The next day, in an attempt to combat this impression, a monk asserted that he had seen a huge fly buzzing around Grandier's head. As Beelzebub, he claimed, meant god of flies in Hebrew, it was quite evident that it was that demon himself who, taking the form of one of his subjects, had come to carry off the magician's soul. When everything was prepared, the executioner passed the rope, with which he intended to strangle him, around Grandier's neck. Then the priests exorcised the earth, air, and wood, and again demanded of their victim if he would not publicly confess his crimes. Urbain replied that he had nothing to say, but that he hoped, through the martyr's death he was about to die, to be that day with Christ in paradise. The clerk then read his sentence to him for the 4th time, and asked if he persisted in what he had said under torture. "Most certainly I do," said Urbain, for it was the exact truth. Upon this, the clerk withdrew, first informing Grandier that if he had anything to say to the people, he was at liberty to speak. But this was precisely what the exorcists did not want. They knew Grandier's eloquence and courage, and a firm, unshaken denial at the moment of death would be most prejudicial to their interests. As soon as Grandier opened his lips to speak, they dashed such a quantity of holy water in his face that it took away his breath. It was only for a moment, however, and he recovered himself and again endeavored to speak. A monk then stooped down and stifled the words by kissing him on the lips. Grandier, guessing his intention, said loud enough for those next to the pyre to hear, "That was the kiss of Judas." At these words, the monks became so enraged that one of them struck Grandier 3 times in the face with a crucifix, while appearing to offer it for him to kiss. But by the blood that flowed from his nose and lips at the 3rd blow, those standing near perceived the truth. All Grandier could do was to call out for a Salve Regina and an Ave Maria, which many immediately began to repeat, while he, with clasped hands and eyes raised to heaven, commended himself to God and the Virgin. The exorcists then made one more effort to get him to confess publicly, but he exclaimed, "My fathers, I have said all I had to say. I hope in God and in His mercy." At this refusal, the anger of the exorcists surpassed all bounds. Father Lactance, taking a twist of straw, dipped it in a bucket of pitch standing beside the pyre, lit it with a torch, and thrust it into his face, crying, "Miserable wretch! Will nothing force you to confess your crimes and renounce the devil?" "I do not belong to the devil," said Grandier, pushing away the straw with his hands. "I have renounced the devil. I now renounce him and all his works again, and I pray that God may have mercy on me." At this, without waiting for the signal from the provost's lieutenant, Father Lactance poured the bucket of pitch on one corner of the pile of wood and set fire to it. Thereupon Grandier called the executioner to his aid, who, hastening up, tried in vain to strangle him while the flames spread rapidly. "Ah, my brother," said the sufferer, "is this the way you keep your promise?" "It's not my fault," answered the executioner. "The monks have knotted the cord so that the noose cannot slip." "Oh, Father Lactance! Father Lactance! Have you no charity?" cried Grandier. The executioner, by this time, was forced by the increasing heat to jump down from the pyre, being almost overcome. Seeing this, Grandier stretched forth a hand into the flames and said, "Father Lactance, God in heaven will judge between you and me. I summon you to appear before him in 30 days. Grandier was then seen attempting to strangle himself, but either because it was impossible or because he felt it would be wrong to end his life by his own hands, he desisted. Clasping his hands, he prayed aloud, "Deus meus ad te vigilo miserere me." "My God, to you I watch, have mercy on me." A Capuchin, fearing he would have time to say more, approached the pyre from the side that had not yet caught fire and dashed the remainder of the holy water in his face. This caused such smoke that Grandier was hidden for a moment from the eyes of the spectators. When it cleared away, it was seen that his clothes were now alight. His voice could still be heard from the midst of the flames, raised in prayer. Then 3 times, each time in a weaker voice, he pronounced the name of Jesus, and giving one cry, his head fell forward on his breast. At that moment, the pigeons which had till then never ceased to circle around the stake, flew away and were lost in the clouds. Urbain Grandier had given up the ghost. Chapter 12. This time, it was not the man executed who was guilty, but his executioners. Consequently, readers will be anxious to learn something of their fates. Father Lactance died in terrible agony on September 18, 1634, exactly 1 month after Grandier's death. His brother monks believed this was due to Satan's vengeance. However, others, remembering Grandier's summons, suggested it was rather due to God's justice. Several circumstances seem to support the latter opinion. The author of the History of the Devils of Loudun recounts one such circumstance, for which he vouches. Some days after Grandier's execution, Father Lactance fell ill with the disease from which he died. Feeling it was of supernatural origin, he decided to make a pilgrimage to Notre Dame des Ardilliers de Saumur, a site of many esteemed miracles. He was offered a place in the carriage of Sieur de Canaille for the journey. This gentleman, accompanied by a large party intent on pleasure, was setting out for his estate of Grand Fonds, which lay in the same direction. The offer was made because Canaille and his friends, having heard that Grandier's last words had affected Father Lactance's mind, expected to find amusement in exciting the terrors of their traveling companion. Indeed, for a day or two, the companions sharpened their wits at the expense of the monk. Then, all at once, on a good road, and without apparent cause, the carriage overturned. Though no one was hurt, the accident seemed so strange to the pleasure-seekers that it ended even the boldest jokes. Father Lactance himself appeared melancholy and preoccupied. That evening at supper he refused to eat, repeating over and over again, "It was wrong of me to deny Grandier the confessor he asked for. God is punishing me, God is punishing me." The following morning, the journey resumed. However, Father Lactance's evident distress had so dampened the spirits of the party that all their gaiety had vanished. Suddenly, just outside Fennet, where the road was excellent and no obstacle apparent, the carriage overturned for the 2nd time. Although again no one was hurt, the travelers felt there was someone among them against whom God's anger was turned. Their suspicions pointed to Father Lactance, so they went on their way, leaving him behind, feeling very uncomfortable at the thought of having spent 2 or 3 days in his society. Father Lactance at last reached Notre Dame des Ardilliers. But however numerous the miracles performed there, the remission of the doom pronounced by the martyr on Father Lactance was not among them. At 6:15 on September 18th, exactly a month to the very minute after Grandier's death, Father Lactance expired in excruciating agony. Father Tranquil's turn came 4 years later. The malady that attacked him was so extraordinary that physicians were baffled, forced to declare their ignorance of any remedy. His shrieks and blasphemies were so distinctly heard in the streets that his brother Franciscans, fearing the effect they would have on his reputation, especially among those who had seen Grandier die with words of prayer, spread the rumor that the devils he had expelled from the nuns' bodies had entered the exorcist's own body. He died shrieking, "My God, how I suffer! Not all the devils and all the damned together endure what I endure." His panegyrist, whose book details his horrible death to illustrate the advantages of belonging to the true faith, remarks, "Truly, his big, generous heart must have been a hot hell for those fiends who entered his body to torment it." The following epitaph, placed over his grave, was interpreted, according to the predispositions of those who read it, either as a testimony to his sanctity or as proof of his punishment. "Here lies Father Tranquil of Saint Remy, a humble Capuchin preacher. The demons, no longer able to endure his fearlessly exercised power as an exorcist, and encouraged by sorcerers, tortured him to death on May 31st, 1638. But a death about which there could be no doubt as to the cause was that of the Surgeon Manori, the same who, as readers may recall, was the first to torture Grandier. One evening, around 10 o'clock, he was returning from visiting a patient on the outskirts of town, accompanied by a colleague and preceded by his surgery attendant carrying a lantern. When they reached the center of town in the Rue Grand Pave, which passes between the walls of the castle grounds and the gardens of the Franciscan monastery, Mannouri suddenly stopped. Staring fixedly at an object invisible to his companions, he exclaimed with a start, "Oh, there is Grandier." "Where? Where?" cried the others. He pointed in the direction towards which his eyes were turned and, beginning to tremble violently, asked, "What do you want with me, Grandier? What do you want?" A moment later he added, "Yes, yes, I am coming." Immediately, it seemed as if the vision vanished from his eyes, but the effect remained. His brother surgeon and the servant brought him home, but neither candles nor daylight could allay his fears. His disordered brain showed him Grandier perpetually standing at the foot of his bed. For a whole week, as was known throughout the town, he remained in this condition of abject terror. Then the spectre seemed to move from its place and gradually draw nearer, for he kept repeating, "He is coming! He is coming!" At length, towards evening, at about the same hour Grandier expired, Surgeon Mannouri drew his last breath. We have yet to tell of Monsieur de Laubardemont. All we know is thus related in the letters of Monsieur de Patin. On the 9th instant, at 9 o'clock in the evening, a carriage was attacked by robbers. On hearing the noise, the townspeople ran to the spot, drawn as much by curiosity as by humanity. A few shots were exchanged, and the robbers were put to flight, with the exception of one man belonging to their band who was taken prisoner, and another who lay wounded on the paving stones. This latter died the next day without having spoken, and left no clue behind as to who he was. His identity was, however, at length made clear. He was the son of a high dignitary named de Laubardemont, who in 1634, as royal commissioner, condemned Urbain Grandier, a poor priest of Loudun, to be burnt alive, under the pretense that he had caused several nuns of Loudun to be possessed by devils. These nuns he had so tutored as to their behavior that many people foolishly believed them to be demoniacs. May we not regard the fate of his son as a chastisement inflicted by heaven on this unjust judge, an expiation exacted for the pitilessly cruel death inflicted on his victim, whose blood still cries unto the Lord from the ground? Naturally, the persecution of Urbain Grandier attracted the attention not only of journalists but also of poets. Among the many poems it inspired, the following is one of the best. Urbain speaks. Chapter 12. This time, it was not the man executed who was guilty, but his executioners. Consequently, readers will be anxious to learn something of their fates. Father Lactance died in terrible agony on September 18, 1634, exactly 1 month after Grandier's death. His brother monks believed this was due to Satan's vengeance. However, others, remembering Grandier's summons, suggested it was rather due to God's justice. Several circumstances seem to support the latter opinion. The author of the History of the Devils of Loudun recounts one such circumstance, for which he vouches. Some days after Grandier's execution, Father Lactance fell ill with the disease from which he died. Feeling it was of supernatural origin, he decided to make a pilgrimage to Notre Dame de Ardilliers de Saumur, a site of many esteemed miracles. He was offered a place in the carriage of Sieur de Canaille for the journey. This gentleman, accompanied by a large party intent on pleasure, was setting out for his estate of Grand Fonds, which lay in the same direction. The offer was made because Canaille and his friends, having heard that Grandier's last words had affected Father Lactance's mind, expected to find amusement in exciting the terrors of their traveling companion. Indeed, for a day or two, the companions sharpened their wits at the expense of the monk. Then, all at once, on a good road, and without apparent cause, the carriage overturned. Though no one was hurt, the accident seemed so strange to the pleasure-seekers that it ended even the boldest jokes. Father Lactance himself appeared melancholy and preoccupied. That evening at supper he refused to eat, repeating over and over again, "It was wrong of me to deny Grandier the confessor he asked for. God is punishing me, God is punishing me." The following morning, the journey resumed. However, Father Lactance's evident distress had so dampened the spirits of the party that all their gaiety had vanished. Suddenly, just outside Fennet, where the road was excellent and no obstacle apparent, the carriage overturned for the second time. Although again no one was hurt, the travelers felt there was someone among them against whom God's anger was turned. Their suspicions pointed to Father Lactance, so they went on their way, leaving him behind, feeling very uncomfortable at the thought of having spent 2 or 3 days in his society. Father Lactance at last reached Notre Dame d'Ardilliers. But however numerous the miracles performed there, the remission of the doom pronounced by the martyr on Father Lactance was not among them. At 6:15 on September 18th, exactly a month to the very minute after Grandier's death, Father Lactance expired in excruciating agony. Father Tranquil's turn came 4 years later. The malady that attacked him was so extraordinary that physicians were baffled, forced to declare their ignorance of any remedy. His shrieks and blasphemies were so distinctly heard in the streets that his brother Franciscans, fearing the effect they would have on his reputation, especially among those who had seen Grandier die with words of prayer, spread the rumor that the devils he had expelled from the nuns' bodies had entered the exorcist's own body. He died shrieking, "My God, how I suffer! Not all the devils and all the damned together endure what I endure." His panegyrist, whose book details his horrible death to illustrate the advantages of belonging to the true faith, remarks, "Truly, his big, generous heart must have been a hot hell for those fiends who entered his body to torment it." The following epitaph, placed over his grave, was interpreted, according to the predispositions of those who read it, either as a testimony to his sanctity or as proof of his punishment. "Here lies Father Tranquil of Saint Remy, a humble Capuchin preacher. The demons, no longer able to endure his fearlessly exercised power as an exorcist, and encouraged by sorcerers, tortured him to death on May 31st, 1638. But a death about which there could be no doubt as to the cause was that of the surgeon Mannouri, the same who, as readers may recall, was the first to torture Grandier. One evening, around 10 o'clock, he was returning from visiting a patient on the outskirts of town, accompanied by a colleague and preceded by his surgery attendant carrying a lantern. When they reached the center of town in the Rue Grandpave, which passes between the walls of the castle grounds and the gardens of the Franciscan monastery, Mannouri suddenly stopped. Staring fixedly at an object invisible to his companions, he exclaimed with a start, "Oh, there is Grandier." "Where? Where?" cried the others. He pointed in the direction towards which his eyes were turned and, beginning to tremble violently, asked, "What do you want with me, Grandier? What do you want?" A moment later he added, "Yes, yes, I am coming." Immediately, it seemed as if the vision vanished from his eyes, but the effect remained. His brother surgeon and the servant brought him home, but neither candles nor daylight could allay his fears. His disordered brain showed him Grandier perpetually standing at the foot of his bed. For a whole week, as was known throughout the town, he remained in this condition of abject terror. Then the spectre seemed to move from its place and gradually draw nearer, for he kept repeating, "He is coming! He is coming!" At length, towards evening, at about the same hour Grandier expired, Surgeon Mannouri drew his last breath. We have yet to tell of Monsieur de Laubardemont. All we know is thus related in the letters of Monsieur de Patin. On the 9th instant, at 9 o'clock in the evening, a carriage was attacked by robbers. On hearing the noise, the townspeople ran to the spot, drawn as much by curiosity as by humanity. A few shots were exchanged, and the robbers were put to flight, with the exception of one man belonging to their band who was taken prisoner, and another who lay wounded on the paving stones. This latter died the next day without having spoken, and left no clue behind as to who he was. His identity was, however, at length made clear. He was the son of a high dignitary named de Laubardemont, who in 1634, as royal commissioner, condemned Urbain Grandier, a poor priest of Loudun, to be burned alive, under the pretense that he had caused several nuns of Loudun to be possessed by devils. These nuns he had so tutored as to their behavior that many people foolishly believed them to be demoniacs. May we not regard the fate of his son as a chastisement inflicted by heaven on this unjust judge, an expiation exacted for the pitilessly cruel death inflicted on his victim, whose blood still cries unto the Lord from the ground. Naturally, the persecution of Urbain Grandier attracted the attention not only of journalists but also of poets. Among the many poems it inspired, the following is one of the best. Urbain speaks, "From hell came tidings that by horrible sanctions I had made a pact with the devil to have power over women, though no one could be found to accuse me. In the trial which delivered me to torture and the stake, the demon who accused me invented and suggested the crime, and his testimony was the only proof against me. The English in their rage burnt the maid alive. Like her, I too fell a victim to revenge. We were both accused falsely of the same crime. In Paris she is adored, in London abhorred. In Loudun some hold me guilty of witchcraft, some believe me innocent, some halt between two minds. Like Hercules I loved passionately, like him I was consumed by fire. But he by death became a god. The injustice of my death was so well concealed that no one can judge whether the flames saved or destroyed me, whether they blackened me for hell or purified me for heaven. In vain did I suffer torments with unshaken resolution. They said that I felt no pain, being a sorcerer died unrepentant, that the prayers I uttered were impious words, that in kissing the image on the cross I spat in its face, that casting my eyes to heaven I mocked the saints, that when I seemed to call on God I invoked the devil. Others, more charitable, say, in spite of their hatred of my crime, that my death may be admired, although my life was not blameless, that my resignation showed that I died in hope and faith, that to forgive, to suffer without complaint or murmur, is perfect love, and that the soul is purified from the sins of life by a death like mine.